Hi. Ooh. Marco. Hi. Well, where you going? He's like, I don't know. Bored. I'm walking back and forth. Hi. Marco, you can't just jump on the voice. Yeah, grab you. Rather burn in the blaze of glory, I can't hear you. I don't hear you. I'm moving the dust. Like crazy broken hearts, I don't hear you. I don't hear you now. Oh, one thing's to happen, one thing's to happen, just one thing, always now, one thing, day, yeah. Some melody rose to the sun and tell me I don't hear you. Monday morning, I thought I put against my skin properly. I don't hear you. I wanna take my time, waste one night, and day, wanna touch and stay with you. And say, giving nothing to myself, then I really wanted to know. The walk got a little far, so I got into a cab and set my vinegar. So I should not keep down phone, but I so to get I'd rather have with you. If you now I said anything between you together, anything together. I know I'm gonna take the chance. Okay, things didn't fall, but I have a place to be connected. Train down that road. If I was like crawling back, keeping down, up to them, pushing to find oh, last place that I take, beneath someone does I got yes, I understand you. And it takes about feeling close, feeling like that. I think the best to and with anything you together, with me forever, and you know you want to. I say, take the shot, take the chance, take the shot, happy dance with you. You you have the anchor with the burning. And then rubber. Back in the day, all of that Stop it. It's not right in line to look to bar. I never got into the burning sun. If you living now, you don't know. If you living now, in a day, to tell the world, drop the brains, the world, tell the world, running around, in a day, down and now. Someone last right now. You sign the way. I can see it clear as day. Close your eyes, go fast. Since that what you uh, day, every day, to eternity pass away. Just a step that you, if I could say that's forever, if words could be come through, I'd stay every day like it's brand new again. I would pass through. But they never sleeps, just like you want to be what you blind. Looking out, nothing. Everyone like you through time. The box we can do around now. Don't feel far. Nothing that can stop but nothing never happens in my life. Thank you to me. I feel that all you are Take the pain away from me. I am free. I am a plane that comes from I was meant to be. Never have to take the loan. I just want to be naked. They don't take home. California. Oh, my heart starts screaming. Walking around. Wish it did not stop. How's it going? Now it looks north my time. After and after I die. California dreaming. Mm, mm, mm. My heart is tired of screaming. I think I want to be alone. But I can feel it too. What am I waiting for? I'm afraid without you. Yes, I'm not that good of a person, but I might be enough for you. Mountains feel the sun, snow dances down through. I'm a cigarette and paragraph, but you're never like you because you made who I am. But he's not that good of a person. I feel something again. I can feel you, but my way to go. I'm afraid of you. Just it's not that good of a person. I can not believe you. God, I can feel it too. I'm afraid of you. That's not that good of a person. My goodness. I'm going trying to take out the secrets. I hope you know that you worked it all. Tired Love you. Maybe someone, everyone. So scared of what this could have done. I know that day I lost my own. I just feel the seats are fucking empty. I just love going anywhere at all. I should be my own bedroom. I don't know, guys. People be vibing somewhere else. They do be missing out. Love all. One. I'm so scared of what this could happen. I know that day I've lost that. Oh, how long must I talk about my pain in this song? How long? How long? Apple should get together and just vibe off. Yeah, I know that day I lost my mind. Down, and you know, I'm gone. Must be talking about my song. Son, it doesn't make a difference. I don't care anything about him. Sonny, it doesn't make a difference. I don't care about anything at all. Next song. Woo! One knows what's like to be bad and feel bad behind. No one knows what's like to be there, to be felt like words are as my conscience is. I am words don't know that's no one knows what to feel is in my God. Not but my I have no words. No, 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 that's not not be vengeance back in the and I get to gotta move on. Time to do a little drinking tonight. I'm feeling like a drinking mood. And we're gonna move downstairs, get the laptop fired up, charge my battery in my phone because it's at 18%, which ain't bad. It was at like 1% earlier. So I mean, comparatively, it's good. And look at that. Testing 1, 2. There we go. You want to watch more music, or do you want to watch some videos that are kind of woke? You know, do you want to watch woke videos, or you want to just keep vibing, Cass? I'll let you decide. I'm neutral on if I keep the vibe a flowing or if I just take a negative vibe and I just like and just like crush like all positive spirits all in the one full swoop. Just a contrast of emotion, just to remind people of the horror of reality. Just to douse people in the knowledge of their cost of existence. Either way, I mean, I'm cool with anyone. Yeah, do an alternation of both, I say. Okay. I got you. We will listen to some Sad Boy Sauce. Let's see. Here we go.
Officially given the designation of Unit
Unit
731.
731.
The group then focused all of their efforts into China because, again, that's where most of the test subjects were coming from. But instead of going back to the Zongma Fortress, they now went to a brand new Japanese military research facility. This facility was a massive complex that had over 150 buildings and encompassed over 2 square miles. One of the fascinating things to note about the structure of the building is there was this large, welcome center or area that supposedly anyone who enters the complex has to go through. But that was actually a fake building that was just done for publicity purposes, because in actuality, there was an underground tunnel that they would shuttle prisoners in and out of outside of the public view. So not only
This
was
is
the
all
name and
real, by
purpose
the way.
of the facility a lie,
Everything
but the
that
actual
he's talking
structure
about
and
took
some of the
place
buildings of the facility were a lie as well, as the majority of experiments took
less
place in
than
these
100
underground
years
tunnels
ago.
and cells. Now, into the late 30s, as Japan began to take over more of China, there were other facilities that began to pop up that were also a part of Unit 731, but the primary experiments and travesties that happened took place at this large facility located near Pingfang. And by 1939, Unit 731 consisted of over 10,000 individuals. Now, not all of these 10,000 members were a part of human experimentation. You got to understand, Unit 731 is encompassing the way diseases could be treated, how diseases may be made manifest, and a lot of the experiments that were happening at these other facilities might have been legitimate or had some purpose other than torture. But as far as the events that happened at the primary facility we talked about, those were all pretty evil. The excuse for this large facility as to why they bring in so many Chinese prisoners and exist out here in the middle of the woods away from public eyes is that they were a part of lumber production. So the code name given to experiments that had to do with human experimentation was called Maruta, because Maruta is Japanese for logs. And it was kind of an in-joke in the facility that instead of referring to the prisoners and subjects as prisoners and subjects, they would be called logs. Like, for example, how many logs were cut down today? Or do the logs look healthy? This whole code word thing would keep up through a lot of Unit 731's research. For example, several of the researchers who performed the experiments on prisoners firsthand would publish their findings, but they would publish them saying that it was a long-tailed primate that they did it to, or in some instances, even referring to these subjects as Manchurian monkeys. Again, the Japanese government knew what was happening, but the rest of the world didn't, and the Japanese government would prefer to keep it that way. A lot of the numbers vary, considering several researchers probably came and went during the height of World War II whenever these experiments were at their worst, but at least one point, Unit 731 had about 300 researchers as a part of the Maruta or human experiments at this primary facility. So, what kind of experiments were happening here at this primary facility of Unit 731 that I have been trying to put off talking about all the other aspects of it, so I don't have to get to it.
The horrors of humanity.
Why is it regarded by many to be the worst example of human experimentation, or by some, the worst example of government action against a population ever? So I guess I need to talk about that now. And this is your final warning. Click off if you don't want to hear about it, and I don't blame you. So let's start with how the prisoners got to the facility in the first place. As mentioned, the majority of the subjects were people from the Chinese mainland. While the majority of these were Chinese people, there were also several Russians and Mongolians and Koreans who were captured as well as several Japanese political prisoners who were transferred to the facility as well. They would be transported to the front of the facility in a vehicle that had no windows, so that if there ever was an escape, or if they were ever let out for whatever reason, they couldn't testify where the facility is even located. And then once they got to the facility, they were bagged and taken to the aforementioned underground tunnels. From there, they were placed into an underground cell. Most of them on their way in would be given a vaccine for their own health upon entry, when in actuality, they were being injected with various diseases, and the disease would change based on whatever study the researchers were currently carrying out. Exact estimates of how many people were taken prisoner are kind of nebulous. On the most conservative end of the spectrum, it's about 3,000, but that number could be as high as 30 or 40,000 people who were actually taken to the facility. However many the true number might be, no one ever survived the Unit 731 experiments. The reason no one's sure how many died in the first place, and it took so long for this information to come out, is because no one that ever walked into that building ever walked back out. So what happened to these prisoners? Well, the thing I mentioned that happened at the Togo facility, the stuff about them being made healthy just so they could be bled out and dehydrated, that was still happening, but that was the least of the prisoners' worries. The average lifespan of a prisoner at Unit 731 was about 2 months. If you were lucky, then you were killed quickly in one of the conventional weapon experiments. These experiments were exactly what they sound like. They would take several of the prisoners and place them in a courtyard. One of the things they would do is they would place people in rings at various distances from each other and then throw a hand grenade in the middle to see what lethality the grenade had out to these different rings of people. They would set people on fire with flamethrowers and see how long it took them to burn up. They would line up people in a straight row and then shoot them with rifles and pistols to see the penetration capability. They would sharpen bladed weapons to various degrees to see how sharp a knife needed to be to fully cut through somebody. And of course, as mentioned, this was all done to participants who were fully awake and conscious of the death they experienced. And again, that's if you were lucky. If you were unlucky, then you were a part of the disease trials. So the disease trials were similar to the things mentioned in the Togo unit, where they would infect people with things like the plague and then dissect them while they're alive to see the various stages of infection within the body. But they had been doing the bubonic plague research for years at this point. Again, the time period we're talking about now is generally like 1940, 1941. So the plague research has moved on to much larger demographics. Again, a lot of the records of Unit 731 were destroyed at the end of the war, but from what we know, there was at least 12 field tests of things like the bubonic plague, and 11 of them took place in Chinese cities. So Unit 731 researchers would deposit plague-infected fleas into the middle of a Chinese populace or infect their wells and homes with things like typhoid. And then these researchers would watch from a distance and then walk through these decayed cities in their sterile garbs, recording the number of casualties. At the very least, tens of thousands of people died immediately from these large-scale weapon tests. Entire countrysides of people were destroyed by infected fleas that were simply thrown out in a clay pot. Back at the facility, the feasibility of chemical and biological weapons was being tested as well. They would have prisoners stand out in fields wearing different layers of protection, from completely naked to normal clothes to gas masks and what have you, and then they would just bombard them with things like mustard gas or sulfur gas and see how long it takes them to die at whatever stage of protection they're in. Another thing that the researchers were interested in was weaponizing venereal diseases. So to do this, they purposefully infected a bunch of people with STDs. However, the injections of the STDs tended to not take properly. So as an alternative, male and female prisoners were led into cells and then at
It
gunpoint
gets worse.
forced to transfer the diseases.
It
And as
gets
mentioned
worse.
previously, at various stages of the disease's progression, the individual would be vivisected to see what it's doing to the body. And even all of that is within the realm of feasibility, as evil.
See, if you wonder why I basically have, I believe it's an obligation to do the activism that I do, but I have fucking no hope, guys. Humans are fucking beyond evil. I'm basically a psychopath. I have some horrible fucking desires, but like, when it comes down to it, the fact that just the average person can do some of the things that are about to be described here, it gives me fucking zero hope for humanity to ever understand the nature of suffering of others.
As depraved, as monstrous as it is, you can wrap your head around the concept of, okay, well, if someone really, really believed that the people they were torturing aren't really people, and this is all for the greater good, you can see a purpose, to them at least. They can see a purpose at the end of the tunnel as to why they're doing this, right? Well, that's before we get into what I can only describe as Machiavellian torture methods. Because sure, they're wanting to use new diseases in the war, so they got to test those, right? But some of the other stuff they did was simply no other explanation than depravity, or at least none other than I can think of. So to just read off a few of the things that happened at Unit 731, and again, these are things that records were not destroyed of, and people would later confess to. So if it's possible,
Not
it is very
destroyed.
likely that worse stuff than this
And
happened
people
as well.
willing to
People were
confess.
cut open while alive and had various organs removed before they were stitched back up to just see what would happen. So for example, cutting out someone's lower GI tract to see how long it takes them to die from that, taking out someone's stomach and attaching their gut to their throat to see what that does. People had their limbs cut off, in some cases to visualize how long it took for someone to bleed out. But in other cases, they would saw off both arms and then switch the shoulder that the arm was attached to just to see if the body could reattach it. People were placed inside of low pressure chambers and the pressure cranked up to see how long it took for things like their eyes to fly out or their chest to implode. People were hung upside down by ropes tied to their ankles to see how long it took them to die from blood pressure to the head. People had very large and heavy objects like crates and rocks dropped on them to see how much force it took to kill someone from being crushed. People were placed inside of centrifuges and the speed ramped up until they were dead to see how much G-force it took to kill someone. And as depressing as it is, I should also mention the fact that they determined that children had a lower tolerance to it than adults. People were given intravenous injections of things like
what that
horse blood
means.
and seawater.
They literally put the Japanese during World War II literally put women, children inside a giant fucking like little looking like basically an amusement ride thing. It spun around in circles so fast that it literally liquefied their fucking brains and internal organs. And then the children found out, yeah, children can't take it as much as adults. Their bodies aren't as adaptive, I guess. Liquefies just a little wee bit faster. Yay! Science. This is what the cost of life is. The cost of
in just to
knowledge.
see what would happen. People had their limbs placed in very cold buckets of water until their limbs were removed, and according to researchers, it felt and sounded as if it was wood, and then the limb would either be crushed to see what the damage of a frozen limb that becomes injured might be. They were set on fire to see if anything could be recovered from that. They tested various ways to warm someone back up after they were frozen to that degree. According to Ishii himself, again, the lead researcher, they did various experiments where they took babies that were under a month old and placed them in freezing water and freezing elements just to see how long it took them to die of hypothermia. I'm going to read this next one from an excerpt from Hal Gold. He wrote a book called Japan's Infamous Unit 731, which is a book breaking down this whole topic. And Hal says in one portion, it was said that a small number of these poor men, women, and children who became Marudas were also mummified alive in total dehydration experiments. They sweated themselves to death under the heat of several hot, dry fans. At death, the corpses would weigh only about a fifth of their normal body weight. And in some cases, they would just decapitate people and take notes about it. It really is bizarre the level of insanity this entails. Like, not only is it evil, but it's also so dumb, right? Like, if you just cut someone's head off, what are you even studying? Like I said, of course it's evil. I'm not saying obviously that any of it was better than the others, but when a military tests a weapon, as evil as it is, you could think to yourself, okay, I understand why they did that. But some of these things, just like mummifying people, shattering their frozen limbs, leaving babies out to die, like, it's a strange debauchery. There's all these stories we hear about that, like when Rome fell, there were these big swinger parties and everyone would get high until they were dead, right? And a similar thing happened at the end of World War II in places like Nazi Germany. It's like they were like rapping on the gates of death, just going to go out in a blaze of glory. But this was a group of scientists who did it for a couple decades. Like, how, or at least the intensity of it for 5 years, right? Like, we don't even have the excuse that they were about to die or they thought they were just going to bust hell wide open. Like, it was just a continuous, thought out evil with seemingly no purpose that was signed off by members of governments, military, and the scientific community. And that's what makes it so terrifying. Perhaps the worst fate of anyone in Unit 731, or I'll say definitely the worst fate, was of the pregnancy studies. So as mentioned, the average lifespan of someone in Unit 731 was about 2 months.
Yeah, Anthony, to listen here.
That number is skewed a bit
just
because a
know
lot of people
that
who got
if you think that people have that the fucking people, the breeders have no fucking empathy for children, yeah, you're gonna have another. Yeah, it just gets fucking worse. It just gets fucking worse.
out there were killed within the first week, things like the weapon testing. The reason that the average comes out to 2 months is because several of the studies were women who were, similar to the STDs, forcefully impregnated by either another prisoner at gunpoint or by one of the guards themselves. Similar to the other diseases, a lot of them were dissected while alive at various points in their pregnancy just so they could look at how the fetus was developing. And in other cases, the women were effectively used as a breeding stock so that the researchers could have a fresh batch of infants for several of their tests, like the hypothermia test, as mentioned earlier. And you know what gets me about it? Like, I've looked at so many disturbing things. As a matter of fact, I knew a lot about Unit 731 because I covered it on the disturbing movie Iceberg. There's a film that I should have looked up before I started recording. There's two of them. There's Philosophy of a Knife, which I talked about in the disturbing movie Iceberg, and Men Behind the Sun. Both of them go into graphic detail about what happened at Unit 731. So I had seen those, so I'm like, wow, I already knew that, the Japanese government did all of these evil, evil things to these people. And I, knew about the frozen trials, knew about the chemical weapon trials, even things like the pregnancy experiments. So, like, I knew all of that going into research for this. But the part that threw me off that I wasn't expecting that I would see, actually, believe it or not, came from Wikipedia. Typically, Wikipedia is a horrible source to get information from because people can just change stuff, and sometimes they just flat out make it up. But whenever I was brushing up for this, I decided I'd look at Wikipedia to see how they had it laid out. And they had an account that I hadn't read anywhere before that kind of stopped me in my tracks. There's at least one recorded instance of friendly social interaction between prisoners and Unit 731 staff. Technician Naokota Ishibashi interacted with two female prisoners. One prisoner was a 21-year-old Chinese woman, the other a Soviet girl who was 19 years of age. Ishibashi asked where she came from and learned that she was from Ukraine. The two prisoners told Ishibashi that they had not seen their faces in a mirror since being captured and begged him to get one. Ishibashi sneaked a mirror to them through a hole in the cell door. And that bothers me so much more than a lot of the other information I read. And the reason for that is because, again, I'm pretty desensitized to just brutality, right? Like the number of historical stories I read about that has to do with people getting, skinned alive or, brutal executions. Like that's just history, right? It's bloody, it's brutal, evil's always existed. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it is a lot easier to throw a label of ignorance on top of everything, right? Like we take it for granted in the modern age because everyone's hyper connected by the internet, right? Like what you're watching this video on right now. And it's really easy for us to take human connection for granted. To just say, well, of course, I know that this other group of people is of equal worth as myself because I talk to them. I know several of them. I experience it. And it's easy to go in with that mindset and look at history and be like, oh, well, yeah, I could see how the Imperial Japanese would, be so tricked by their government because they just weren't as educated. They weren't as enlightened as we were, right? So it's easier to read stories about things like Unit 731 if you kind of turn your brain off and you're like, this was a group of people who just didn't see the others as human. And that's why these tragedies were allowed to happen. But then I read the story of a guard who saw two girls, young women, who wanted to remember what they looked like. And he recognized that they needed to feel something, that they needed to have that. So he broke rules and snuck them a mirror. And it made me cold. Because then it's not just a person who let themselves get tricked and convinced themselves that they were dealing with cattle, right? Which if these experiments were done with animals, I think we'd all still agree that it's evil and terrible. But maybe that was his mindset, right? That he's just dealing with animals. But to read that he took pity on two girls who wanted to remember what they looked like, terrified me. Because at least some of them were fully aware that these people were suffering and that was wrong. Not just that they were suffering and this was for the greater good, but that they were suffering and something should be done. And in spite of that, it kept happening. It was such a powerful force of government and people and the greater good that these tragedies kept going on. And the people who participated were well aware of the pain they were inflicting and didn't stop it. And that is so much worse than a group of people who were just following their orders and turned off their ears. This guy still had ears. He was still listening, and he kept following those orders. Along that same note of kind of the illusion of us versus them fading, there was one, I believe he was a guard there. Some said guard, some said he was like a research assistant. Someone who wasn't a high-ranking researcher named Yoshio Sudo, who got infected with the plague while he was there because, everyone's dealing with these volatile diseases. So one of the workers gets infected. So they cut that guy open. Like, I guess they figured, well, he's a test subject now. We're not going to let him go to waste. Who cares if he's Japanese? And they sliced him open, too. It's interesting. While kind of the Japanese government's idea was, well, we're more important than they are, so they can suffer. But we see these glimpses of the Japanese who are infected being treated the same as everyone else who's infected, and also the Japanese recognizing that these people have emotions and feelings, and it makes the situation so much more scary.
Yeah, probably.
And I think one of the reasons it is so scary is because, again, we read a lot of stories like this, and it's comforting to think, oh, well, if they just knew better, right? Like, oh, well, maybe if they didn't have to struggle for resources as much, or maybe if they were allowed to experience humanity from this other side that they seem to hate so much, maybe then, they wouldn't have had to do the awful things they did, right? It's easier to read a lot of history that way. But you see instances like that, and it's dreadful, the idea that, sure, they had all that, it didn't change anything. Near the end of World War II, the Japanese government got desperate and decided to rely on Unit 731 for some kind of drastic measure against the United States. So, using the bubonic plague research that the Japanese had figured out, again by testing it on residents of China, the Japanese government put together a plan called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan for this was to release the bubonic plague on San Francisco, and the attack was scheduled to take place on September the 22nd of 1945. But this plan never came to fruition because just over a month before September 22nd, America dropped the atomic bombs on Japan and ended the war. In these final days of the war, the members of Unit
A
731
perfect
realized
example of negative utility. We nuke the fuck out of Japan, everybody vaporize in an instant. Sure, that's an evil. But we, in a way, prevented entire mass infection of the United States of the bubonic plague. So, cracking eggs prevent the danger omelet.
that the war courts would not err in their favor and decided to destroy whatever evidence they could. And of course, this evidence began with the prisoners, who were forced to either ingest poison or be shot before the facility itself was set on fire and most of the documents and research destroyed. And as mentioned, no one who ever entered Unit 731 as a prisoner ever walked out. When Douglas MacArthur came to Japan after the war was over, he immediately heard whispers of things like human experimentation. After tracking down Ishii and the other leaders of Unit 731, they confessed that some degree of human experimentation took place, but wouldn't give MacArthur specific details. MacArthur threatened that if the remnants of 731 don't comply with the United States, then the United States would allow the Russians to judge the members of Unit 731. And I don't know if you know this, but especially right after World War II, you much wanted to be in a United States tribunal than a Russian tribunal, because Americans typically ended with prison sentences and Russians ended with rope. So a deal was struck between MacArthur and the head researchers of Unit 731 that said if the researchers of 731 turned over all of their data to the United States, then they would be given full immunity. And of course,
Yep.
both sides agreed to that deal. Now, a couple things.
You heard this. You heard it here, guys. In the name of science, in the name of research, and in the name of maintaining knowledge, there's no justice in this universe. I mean, in a way, it's a good thing. I mean, at least their suffering didn't go to waste. But there's no justice here. Every single one of them that got caught, released. Not a single person. Yeah. Every single baby spun around in a fucking circle of its brain kind of jelly. Every parent screaming as they're cut open alive. And that person held the knife in their hand. Not a shred of justice. They walk the streets of America as a researcher.
The reason this deal was done is because, one, and most importantly, America was afraid of what might happen if the Russians, who shortly after World War II began the Cold War and all of that, or the Cold War began between the United States and Russia, I should say, America was afraid of what would happen if the Russians got their hand on all of that information. So it was more so done not so America could have biological weapons. I mean, we're not dropping plagues on populated cities, at least. That's what they want you to think. But really, it wasn't so much that we could have the information as much as we didn't want the Russians to have the information. And the other reason that the deal was taken is because, not really that I think it would have changed anything, but most of the details of what happened weren't known until decades after World War II ended. Like most of the stuff I read about came out in confessions in the 70s and 80s. And while MacArthur knew that there was some level of human experimentation, I mean, the data he was handed talked about how long it took for the researchers to witness someone dying of hypothermia, right? Like, he couldn't have been totally dumb to it, but at least the brutality and methods of it, they probably weren't aware of at the time. Not that I think that would have stopped them from it, but maybe they wouldn't have given full immunity. Maybe I just like to think they wouldn't have given them full immunity if they knew the full extent, but whatever, it still happened. Now, keep in mind, to the public at that time, none of this had ever happened. To the Japanese government, to the Chinese, Unit 731 was a crazy conspiracy theory if you thought anything weird was happening out there, because it's just for public health and lumber for some reason. So whenever the immunity deal was made, part of the deal was that America would keep up the lie that nothing ever happened at Unit 731, and all of the members of Unit 731 could change their name, and America wouldn't release their identities to the public. So after America makes this whole plea deal with them, eventually Russia shows up, and they actually have a trial for some of the members of Unit 731, and as you can imagine, didn't care to consult the U.S. over it. So Russia holds a trial, and they end up getting 12 people who they can confirm were in Unit 731, and the sentences for those 12 who were found guilty were 2 to 25 years in a labor camp, of which the most any of them served was 7 years. Now, if you know anything about Russian history with war crimes, the idea that these men weren't shot or hanged is absurd. especially that they ended up just serving 2 to 7 years, respectively for different people. That is insane. How did that happen? Well, if you'll remember, the American deal with the Russians wasn't made official until like the 80s, and some researchers were going to talk about, put in the work and made it come to be. So the fact that the Russians show up, they talk to the Japanese for a while, and only a few of the 731 researchers get like 5 years in prison, it is pretty much guaranteed that the Russians made a deal with the Japanese, very similar to the deal America made with them. So at the end of the day, this group of people who were monstrous, demons even, committed a massive amount of bloodshed and misery. And then when the going got tough, they sold that bloodshed and misery to the highest bidder and got off scot-free. So ain't that a kick in the pants? Now, again, none of this was public information, and it would have stayed that way if it wasn't for the work of various Japanese historians. See, again, Unit 731 for years was like a boogeyman. There would be a researcher come out in like the 60s or 70s talking about how the project was real or they were a part of it and they can attest to it. And they would get laughed off by the media, saying that they were just some crazy conspiracy theorists. Historians pulled various records in Japan that supported the government's sanctioning of Unit 731. And in 1983, a historian published his findings and was told by the Japanese Board of Education that he should take those findings out of textbooks because it's not backed historically. So these historians went to the United States, and now, because everything's declassified, went through various records and found MacArthur's immunity deals and the records that he got directly from the Unit 731 experiments, and were able to bring those records back to Japan, show them to the Board of Education, and say, it's real, it's all right here. And from then on, the Japanese government slowly began to admit fault in the Unit 731 experiments. Through the 1990s, the Japanese government finally acknowledged that it was a real thing, but not the specifics of what the researchers actually did. The most recent development of Unit 731 was in 2018, when the Japanese government named the 3,607 researchers who were a part of the unit. And as you can imagine, between all 3,607 of those names, they're all either dead or have disappeared. Shiro Ishii, if you'll remember, the leader of all of Unit 731, died on October the 9th of 1959 from laryngeal cancer, never experiencing judgment on this side of eternity for his role in the Japanese war crimes. And Unit 731, like I said at the beginning of this video, is depressing. There's no two ways about it. There's no happy ending. There's no good side to it. It was a group of people committed atrocities, and they got away with it, effectively. And there's no polish I can give that. But what I can give polish is that this story was almost entirely lost for history. If you were from World War II, from these events happening up until like 1984, when it finally became official, the people who died never died, at least publicly. Their names were just lost as some of the many names lost in World War II. And they were just a statistical anomaly because governments didn't want to acknowledge the atrocities that they had once condoned, or that the forerunners before them had condoned. And of course, obviously, I don't mean any of my critiques of the Japanese government during World War II to apply to now. But again, that was less than a century ago. It's hard to think about that humanity is capable of that kind of evil and that kind of justification for that kind of evil. But the point I want to bring out, the one light in all of it, I could say, is the people who would not be quiet, the people who kept learning, who kept digging, and now we have names of the perpetrators, and we have death of the victims. We have cause of the victims. And while it doesn't make it right, and the suffering still happened, it gives some meaning to it. Their names are not simply lost, they were taken. And hopefully by understanding why they were taken and what great evil led to it, we can prevent tragedies like that from ever happening again. And like I said, Unit 731 is a heavy story, but it's one that I think should be told. Not one I enjoy telling. I didn't have a good time recording this, I'll be honest. But it's one that needs to be. And I'm just a lowly YouTuber. I'm no one important. I'm no one special. But hopefully you got something out of this. Or at least you have more depressing knowledge to terrorize your friends with, which in that case, win-win. But either way, if you got something out of this, or you just like to be miserable like I do, I guess, that's cool. And I just want to say,
thank you. Subscribe to Wendigoon if you haven't. He's a great channel. But let's watch more, let's watch more of humanity's horrors. Just really, dedicate this stream to really just being like, fuck, the human experience, the heights of horror, the heights of existential dread, the gamble that you take with your children. Wow. Just fucking wow. We're gonna ramp it. I mean, you can't get much worse than entire like 40,000 to 43,000 to what was it, like 60,000, I guess, people tortured to death via disease and dissection or worse. I mean, yeah, you can't get much worse than that, but we can try. We can, we can, we can bring it up to a little bit funky levels. Let's find it. Let's find our boy. Where's the radiation man? He who suffered. I mean, everybody's heard of the radiation man. It's just if you haven't heard of like the most like the details of the radiation man's death.
Humanity's history is rife with stories and legends of unimaginably terrible ways to die. From ancient torture methods to a slow death at the hands of nature, there are so many terrible fates that we are going to go ahead and get into it. But as always, thank you for watching. In 1999, Hisashi worked for the Japanese Nuclear Fuel Conversion Company, or JCO. JCO owned several nuclear or nuclear-adjacent facilities around Japan. One of these was the Tokaimura plant that was located in the Ibaraki prefecture of Japan. Now, the Tokaimura plant was not a nuclear facility. Instead, it was a staging area where they made the materials for nuclear reactors. In other words, there was no live nuclear reaction happening at the Tokaimura plant. Instead, they just made the fuel rods that were then sent to nuclear plants. The first stage of this process involves converting uranium hexafluoride into uranium dioxide. This involves a process of taking the uranium and then mixing it with the nitrate so that the uranium is stable enough to be moved around before it is then placed in a nuclear reactor. The way that you are supposed to do this is you take the uranium and nitric acid and you pour it into a small mixing tank. That mixture is then transferred into a large storage tank that prevents the uranium from reacting with other uranium particles and becoming too unstable. It's then ran out of the top of the storage tank and slowly fed into a precipitation tank that makes sure everything is stabilized before they begin to use it in the next steps of the process. Well, that is the government-approved safe method. The way they were doing it at the Tokaimura plant in 1999 was with a bucket. They would just take a stainless steel bucket, put uranium, nitric acid in there, mix it up, and then pour it directly into the precipitation tank. Now, this was apparently something that was happening around a lot of nuclear processing facilities at the time, because it's cheaper than running all the heavy equipment and waiting. And despite the seemingly terrible idea of having people mix uranium in a bucket they're holding with their hands, no accidents had occurred up until this point. The reason being, even though they were handling uranium in a way you should never handle it, the concentration of uranium was never enough that it became dangerous. But if almost every uranium conversion company in Japan was being unsafe, then the Tokaimura plant was being super unsafe. See, they had a history of weird business accidents. In 1997, there was an explosion at the facility that exposed several workers and nearby residents to radioactive materials. It seems that the accident in 1997 involved them burning a bunch of trash inside of the building, inside of like a closed off area, and it just caused air and unburnt fuel to kind of evaporate, and it eventually blew up and caused a big pop. And you don't want air getting rushed out of a radioactive material burning yard, I guess. So realize we're dealing with a company who thinks it's fine to burn trash in a uranium processing plant. This was the facility that Hisashi Uchi worked at. And then one day, on September the 30th, 1999, at around 10 a.m., his boss asked him to come help with the uranium pouring process, something that Hisashi had never done before. So the boss took Hisashi and another man named Masato Hinoshara into the room to begin the conversion process. And this process straight up involved them just taking a bucket, pouring the stuff in, mixing it up, and then handing it up to one of them on the ladder so that they can just pour it into this giant storage tank. Now, in spite of this process being incredibly stupid, they were also breaking two other rules of uranium safety. For one, the correct storage tanks that you're supposed to use in this step are these really tall cylinders. And the reason for that is because if your surface area is too wide and it contains too much uranium that is close together, you can cause a nuclear accident. In simple terms, radioactive uranium is constantly shooting out neutrons. And if one of these neutrons hit another uranium molecule, it can cause a reaction. So storage tanks are literally slimmer so that fewer uranium molecules are right next to each other. But because those storage tanks are too tall and hard to just pour buckets into the top of, they were instead using shorter, not safety-approved tanks. The other mistake they made came directly from JCO. See, JCO was 2 days behind on their order of nuclear rods, and they wanted to ramp up production. So they had increased the concentration of uranium that the men were pouring into the tank. Typically, the concentration in the bucket is about 5% uranium, whereas at this moment with Hisashi and Masato, it's about 18%. So after they get done mixing one of the last buckets, Masato is standing on top of the tank pouring the uranium solution in, and Hisashi comes to his boss, who's holding the funnel above the tank, and tells his boss to go take a seat, and Hisashi will take it from here. So with the 3 men in the room, one of them is on top of the tank pouring, one of them has his hands just above the tank holding the funnel, and the other one is sitting at a desk a few feet away from the tank itself. As the men are pouring the bucket into the storage tank that now contains 70 liters or nearly 20 gallons of uranium solution, disaster strikes. Suddenly, the men hear a loud clap and a glowing blue light begins to emanate from inside of the storage tank. This blue light is a phenomenon known as a Cherenkov light. Cherenkov lights occur whenever nuclear materials reach criticality. Criticality is the state of what I mentioned earlier, whenever the molecules of uranium are so close together that they have a sustaining number of neutrons hitting them and then shooting off to hit other uranium molecules. That means that the nuclear reaction just reached a self-sustaining stage, where the number of neutrons lost by the molecules and the number of neutrons gained stays constant. This is how nuclear energy works. If you put the materials inside of a reactor and then they reach criticality, then they emit energy by just existing. However, the key factor being, this is what you want to happen inside of a nuclear reactor. And criticality and the Cherenkov light can be thought as the reactor turning on. What that means is that by haphazardly pouring uranium into a storage tank, they had now turned on an uncovered nuclear reactor in the middle of the Tokamura district. And the 3 men who were in that room had the rare misfortune of being some of the only people in human history to ever see a completely exposed nuclear reaction. As soon as this happened at 10:35 a.m., alarms all across the plant went off. Their boss, who was sitting at the table a few feet away, yelled, "Run for your lives," and everyone booked it for the door. Hisashi made it into a changing room that connected the room they were in to the rest of the facility. As soon as Hisashi made it into that room, he began throwing up and passed out. At the moment of criticality, the neutron beams that were being emitted in the reaction hit everyone in the room. These neutron beams rip through flesh, tissue, material, and radiate everything they come into contact with. Sievert is a measure of radiation exposure, and the amount of sieverts that it is deemed healthy to be exposed to per year is about 1/1000th of 1 sievert, or in other words, about 1 millisievert a year. If you're a nuclear worker, sometimes you can fudge the numbers and go a little bit over, but never over like 20 millisieverts a year. So keep in mind, 1 is the safe amount for a year. At the moment of criticality, the boss who was sitting at the desk was exposed to about 3,000 millisieverts. Masato, who was pouring the bucket, was exposed to about 8,000 millisieverts. And Hisashi, who was standing next to the tank and had his hand hanging over it, was exposed to about 20,000. Now, 7,000 to 8,000 millisieverts is considered a lethal dose, and initially they thought that Hisashi had been exposed to about 8,000, so maybe there was a chance to save him. But by looking at the chromosomal damage that happened to him, which we'll talk about in a minute, it seems the number was closer to 20,000. So Hisashi experienced 20,000 times the safe amount of radiation that you can take in a year in a few seconds, and somehow was still alive. The moment of criticality caused a huge panic. Within 350 meters of the plant, all houses were evacuated, and up to 10 kilometers away, they were telling people to seek shelter. In the meantime, the workers, including Hisashi, Masato, and their boss, were all evacuated from the facility. And after about 20 uranium that was in the storage tank, it was still a very low amount compared to, a nuclear reactor, so there weren't any permanent effects to the region. However, the same couldn't be said for those 3 men. That same day, a doctor by the name of Meikawa was called regarding the incident. Meikawa was one of Japan's leading experts when it came to radiation sickness and radiation treatment. After learning that the incident at the plant was a criticality incident, Meikawa was amazed that anyone survived at all. So, Meikawa began to put together a team to assess the condition of the 3 victims. The boss had again been exposed to about 3,000 millisieverts, which isn't uncommon in nuclear material accidents, and we'll talk about what happened to him later. Masato was also assessed, but since he didn't receive as much radiation as Hisashi, his case was less critical, and again, we'll talk about what happened to him later. Meikawa's primary concern was Hisashi, who initially, remember, they thought received about 8,000 millisieverts, which is a lethal dose, so he required the most immediate care, although it would later turn out to be more than double that. The first signs that something was really bad with Hisashi, other than the throwing up, which is pretty typical of radiation exposure, was his lymphocyte count. Lymphocytes are an important part of your immune system and a part of your white blood cell content. In a healthy person, the concentration of lymphocytes in your white blood cells is 25 to 48% depending. Whenever they got the results back of Hisashi that were taken 9 hours after exposure, his was down to 1.9%. So his immune system was tanking fast. Meikawa visits Hisashi in the hospital, and to Meikawa's surprise, Hisashi looks fine. The only symptoms he had was a red face and bloodshot eyes. And the only pain that he said he was currently experiencing was a pain just under his right ear and a pain in his right hand. If you'll remember, his right hand was the closest part of his body to the nuclear reaction. Now, while this may sound shocking, this is actually to be expected. Radiation sickness occurs in 4 stages. The first stage, known as the prodrome stage, is the initial literal gut reaction to radiation exposure. Whenever someone's bombarded with a lot of radiation, they may throw up or have diarrhea as kind of a quick nauseous attempt to expel materials from within the body. But then after that typically only lasts a few hours, there's something called the latency period. In the second stage, the body is being destroyed by the radiation and the symptoms of it aren't made known yet. While there may be some pain and discomfort, the patient is normally fine during this period of time. However, following the latency period is the manifestation stage. That's when the damage the radiation caused begins to be made known, as the person can develop anything from an immune system shutdown to skin burning and several other symptoms we're about to see. And then after that, the fourth stage is either recovery or death. So during this period of time, the radiation is destroying Hisashi's body. The effects just aren't known to him or others around yet. And Meikawa, who's seen this before, knows that this is the radiation's theoretical rising of the hammer, and he wants to be there whenever the hammer strikes. So Meikawa has Hisashi transported to his team and his facility at the Tokyo University Hospital. The transfer happens on October the 2nd, 3 days after his exposure. The first device used to artificially assist Hisashi is a breathing apparatus. See, his chest began to hurt as he would breathe, so he began to take very short and shallow breaths. So they hooked him up to a breathing mask that essentially forced his lungs to breathe through the pain. Now, in radiation sickness, the first parts of the body that are destroyed are the mucosal membranes and your immune system. So any part of your body that secretes something like the lining of your intestine or salivary glands in your mouth or mucus glands in your nose, those are almost always fried, meaning that processes like digestion become a lot more difficult. And radiation has a particularly strong effect on your bone marrow, meaning that your entire immune system production is either stopped entirely or delayed for some time. That means that with patients who are suffering from radiation sickness, it is very hard to keep nutrients in their body, and it's also very hard to make sure they don't get sick, because an otherwise harmless infection can quickly become lethal when their body has no way to fight it off. So because of this, the 2 private rooms at the Tokyo University Hospital were effectively turned into a quarantine zone. Now, typically with radiation patients, it is a risk of people around the patient becoming irradiated. That's because most often, radiation exposure comes from radioactive materials. Like, for example, if there is a fire and smoke's irradiated and that gets on people, or they come into contact with irradiated water, or something radioactive explodes and they touch the debris from the explosion, then that person is not only exposed to radiation, but there is enough of the material on or in their body that they can expose people around them to radiation. However, if there's any upside to this case, it's this. That wasn't the case with Hisashi, because if you'll remember, he never came into contact with the materials. It was just the fact that a small nuclear reactor was uncapped right next to him that caused him to be irradiated. So while people who came to treat Hisashi would have to fully deck out and take precautions so that they don't get radiation sickness, because this scenario is so unique and a criticality incident, the doctors and nurses didn't have to worry about exposure. What they did have to worry about was exposing Hisashi to anything. Remember, his immune system shot, so they could have a bacteria or virus on them that is harmless to them, but if they get near Hisashi, it could kill him. So the 2 private rooms at the hospital were converted into a sterile field, where one room was used for staging and cleaning and sterile materials, and the next room that was fitted with curtains on all sides held Hisashi. All of the nurses and doctors said that Hisashi was a pleasure to be around. They said that as they would hand him food or rearrange his pillow or sheets, that he would constantly say thank you, and how he's so honored to have such kind and smart people caring after him. One of the nurses even said that whenever she would come to give Hisashi a bath in his bed, because, he can't get up to take a shower, that every time she'd undress him, he would blush and say that he was so embarrassed and that they should just have his wife come do it. They would talk to him about his personal life, how he loved to go fishing and loved the outdoors. And despite the severity of his exposure, everyone was amazed that his body, even after several days, seemed to be in good condition. Other than things like he needed the respirator to assist with his breathing, there seemed to be no external effect on his body. The first signs of how bad this was going to be happened on October the 5th. The doctors took a sample of Hisashi's bone marrow to see how bad his immune system had been shot. And when they looked at the micrograph, most of them couldn't believe what they were seeing. So, for context, chromosomes are the part of your body that is effectively the blueprint for how your body is built. Your chromosomes exist in every cell, and without them, your body can't build anything. You can kind of think of it as both the foundation and map for how new cells are reproduced. So if your chromosomes are damaged, then that means any new cells reproduced by that cell are going to be damaged or malformed as well. When they looked at the micrograph for what Hisashi's bone marrow looked like, this is a healthy person's chromosome mapping, and this is what Hisashi's look like. This isn't damage to your immune system. This is an erasing of your immune system. The experts couldn't even look at this and tell which of the chromosomes were damaged or destroyed, because then there may be some way to treat it. It was just seen that all of them had been wiped out. The doctors had imagined that a transplant would be needed, but now there's no question of if Hisashi's body can ever recover, because right now it doesn't even have the tools to make new immune cells. After seeing the severity of this, they began a new procedure where they did something called a PCR test. And PCR tests have been a thing for a while, but in 1999, there was a new way that you could get results within a few hours rather than sending it off to a laboratory. A PCR test allows you to see the very early stages of an infection, either a virus, bacteria, or fungus, so that you can see if a microbe is present before it starts to show symptoms. So they did this on Hisashi multiple times a day because if this guy gets like a cold, it will kill him fast because his body has zero defense. Some other figures for you nerds out there like myself, his white blood cell count was about 900, which is a tenth of what it should be, and his platelet count was about 26,000. Healthy people are between 120 and 380,000. So the first order of business is getting this guy a marrow transplant. Their best option for this is a stem cell graft, where stem cells are placed into the bone marrow, where hopefully his system will accept the transplant and then use that chromosomal code as the new blueprint so that it can rebuild his bone marrow. The problem with this is the donor and recipient have to be an exact match on their HLA, or the leukocyte antigens. However, thankfully, despite siblings only having a 1 in 4 chance of being a match, Hisashi's sister was a match. And his sister was more than willing to give up whatever her brother needed to keep him alive. So they gave her a drug that increased the stem cell production in her blood and then did a peripheral blood transfusion. In other words, typically they have to go into the bone marrow and take the sample, but all they did here was spike her body with a lot of stem cells, and then they hooked her up to a machine that took the blood out of her body, separated the blood from the stem cells, and then put the blood back into her body. Now, whereas a normal donation would require a not huge amount of stem cells, they had to rebuild Hisashi's body from scratch. And they ended up taking 160 milliliters of stem cells from Hisashi's sister in a process that took 4.5 hours. So they gave him the transfusion and just had to wait to see if it would take root. In the meantime, the effects were beginning to set in for Hisashi. At first, as mentioned, there was a few minor pains, and then he had trouble breathing, and he began to get very thirsty and dehydrated. Again, his body can't produce any more mucosal linings, so his entire system's going dry. The most frightening development came when, just after a week since his exposure, he began to lose pieces of his skin en masse. It began whenever they would take off the medical tape that was on him to change out tubes or needles, it would just rip entire sections of skin off. At the same time, the nurses who were washing his feet had to stop because anytime they'd scrub his feet, the skin would just peel off. Remember that whole system I described with the bone marrow, where typically the cells that need to be regenerated can't be regenerated anymore? Well, the same applied to Hisashi's skin. Skin, for those that don't know, is constantly growing from the lowest layer of the skin, or the subcutaneous layer, up to the epidermis. In about 2 weeks, the top layer of your skin goes through a complete cycle, and the dead cells simply fall off. But if your body can't produce new cells, then your entire layer of skin just kind of detaches from the rest of you, and you just exist in it like it's some sort of suit. And this dead layer of skin that was disconnected but still completely wrapped around him was just coming off in clumps. The only bright side to this being, since the skin was effectively dead and detached in several spots, it didn't cause a lot of bleeding, because bleeding was also a major concern. If you'll remember, his platelet count was super low, meaning that even the most minor cut or puncture could theoretically cause him to bleed out. Because if he starts bleeding, his body has no way to stop it. On October the 6th, they did an x-ray to see what the issue with his lungs were. They figured that there was obviously radiation damage, but perhaps something was putting pressure on his lungs that was causing his labored breathing. In the x-ray, they saw a dark shadow over his lungs. This could be anything from a fluid buildup or perhaps blood seeping into the lung cavity. However, where the normal treatment for this would just be puncturing a hole in the lung and then drawing the fluid out, if you'll remember, they're afraid to make him start bleeding because they're afraid they can't stop it. So the only thing they can do is just crank up the machine to make him breathe through the pressure. So the machine went from helping him breathe and just, providing oxygen to actively shoving the air into his mouth causing his chest to expand and then sucking it back out. Meaning that anytime Hisashi tried to breathe normally, he was fighting against the positive and negative pressure of the machine. Not to mention that the intensity of the burning he was feeling both inside of his body and from the layer of skin that was beginning to slop off was now even more intense. So when they cranked this machine up, it was excruciating. It was every part of his body that was a part of respiration burning and yelling at him to stop, and the machine breathing for him anyway. As they did it, Hisashi cried and screamed through the machine, telling them to stop, to turn it off. He yelled for his wife and for his mom. And during the treatment, he pushed the nurses back, ripped off the mask, and yelled, "I'm not a guinea pig." This took everyone in the room back. But after someone mentioned Hisashi's family, he realized that, although painful, he needs to endure it for them. So allowed the mask to be put back on and suffered through it. Also, during this time, you're probably asking, why aren't they giving him pain medication? And the answer is that they are, but it's probably not doing a lot. See, for one, they had to figure out the amount of medication they could give him that didn't have any side effects with any of the other dozens of drugs that were running through his system. And also, it turns out from later stages of what happened to him, his blood flow was effectively shot, and a lot of stuff that was delivered intravenously had trouble going anywhere. So even if he was burning and hurting in his chest and face whenever the machine was breathing for him, giving him a shot in the arm to numb it probably didn't help a ton. Which, speaking of drugs, there were so many weird advancements, or I guess advancements made in pharmaceuticals just because of this case. Like there's a drug called pentoxifylline, which was recently banned in Japan that normally existed in oral form because I believe it had heart or liver problems or something like that. But it was the only drug that didn't, cause side effects with other drugs that were in his system. So they tried to get approval from the Japanese government to use it. And then after like a week, they did. But then, as mentioned, a lot of his mucosal lining's falling apart, so he can't ingest it. So it eventually ends up with them finding a dealer in Thailand who can get them the raw ingredients for a venous version that can be injected. So a doctor drives to an airport at 6 a.m. where this delivery of a vial of this medicine is handed to him from Thailand, and he drives it back to the hospital. Multiple times, they had to get the raw ingredients of drugs and synthesize them in new ways on site so that they could deliver them in different methods. Also around this time, doctors from all over the world were coming to assist in this case. Doctors and researchers who had worked at Chernobyl, members of American, Russian, and German delegations. Around the same time that these people started showing up, about October the 10th, Hisashi gave his final messages with his own words to his wife and family. Something that the nurses mentioned is that never in Hisashi's presence did his wife ever cry. The mother and father would come in and cry, the sister would cry in front of him, but every single time that Hisashi's wife walked into that room, she was smiling, she was talking about memories of how they met each other, she was talking about how strong and handsome he is. Not once around him did she ever shed a tear, because his wife knew that if she breaks down, then what else would Hisashi have to go off of? And she wanted to be that picture for him of something to keep living for. So on October the 10th, Hisashi gave his final messages to his wife of how much he loved her before he was placed on a breathing tube. The machine that was pumping oxygen over his mouth couldn't last for long. It was putting a strain on his throat and obviously the pain in his body. So they decided to hook him up to a breathing tube. October the 10th was the last time Hisashi ever spoke, which means that his final words was most likely, "and I love you," to his wife. They could still communicate with him after this. He was still conscious and he could look at people. He would answer yes or no questions with a nod or a shake. He would grasp people's hands and point at things. So his consciousness was still good for now, and everyone was still hopeful that he'll eventually come off the breathing tube. Again, with radiation sickness, after the symptoms begin to form, you just have to treat the symptoms and ride it out to hopefully get to the other side, once the body has regenerated enough that it can fight back. Also during this time, Maekawa, the head doctor, had the furniture in the waiting room replaced with bright and happy colors because Hisashi's family was basically living in that waiting room. So he had new beds put in so that they could sleep there. He had board games added and just stuff to make their stay a little bit better. The family was also very supportive of the doctors and nurses. Anytime Maekawa would do something like that, they would thank him for it. And every single night, Maekawa would come down to that waiting room and give the family a very detailed description of what had happened that day. The family was very attentive. They were very thankful for the doctor's care. And something that the nurses said is that one of the only things that they would do while they were in that waiting room is they would fold little paper cranes. And the grandfather and the son would, or I should say Hisashi's father and son, would just sit at a table in the waiting room and just fold paper cranes all day. And the nurses began to enjoy, walking down to the first floor of the hospital and just seeing little paper cranes set up everywhere. And for some slight good news at the time, remember that white blood cell count? Well, it had gone all the way from 900 down to 100. But after the transfusion with his sister, it worked its way back up to 8,000 at one point.
Good news, right? It's just the beginning. All good intentions and all good news, it has a little bit of hell attached.
And that lymphocyte count that was all the way down at 1.9% got up to 20%. So it seems like the transfusion took, and now his body is building a new immune system. This gave a lot of people hope that in these perfect conditions, the most radioactive man who ever survived could live through the radiation sickness. And since Hisashi couldn't speak at this time, they brought stereos, sanitized of course, into the room with Hisashi, and his family would bring music that he liked, and they would just play it on a loop for him as he lay in the hospital bed. They didn't want to turn on the news because at the time, Hisashi's case was a pretty big deal in the media, mainly because there was already a lot of controversy around nuclear energy and the JCO company. So he was being very publicized as like a victim of the company, and they didn't want the news to be on the radio and Hisashi hear a reporter say like, and that man in the hospital who's definitely going to die because they murdered him so hard. So rather than, filling his head with that, they would play music from his family, or they would just play sounds of nature and of water running through a brook and birds in the trees. And it seemed at this time that things were looking up. That is until they did another micrograph of his immune system. They took another micrograph to see how the chromosomes from his sister's transfusion were doing. And from that, they saw that about 10% of his sister's chromosomes were damaged. That means that even new transplants that were put into his body were being damaged. Now, if this was a radiation exposure to a radioactive material, then that might make sense. If he had inhaled, say, radioactive fumes or something, and they were still in his lungs and like across his bloodstream, that would make sense that new transplanted stuff you put in got damaged. However, it was a neutron beam that hit him. It was the equivalent of like a gunshot ripping right through him. There is no lasting effect that he should have on anything put into his body. Because, the chromosomes that were in his sister's body weren't there to get irradiated to. They showed up in his system over a week after he was exposed to radiation. And somehow they still got damaged. That is like if you got shot and needed like a liver transplant, and then a week after you get the transplant, the liver develops a bullet wound. It made no sense and had the scientists scratching their heads. Some thought it might have been radioactivation, a thing where neutron beams fly into the body and say if it hits a particle of sodium or potassium, it can make those small particles radioactive, but that tends to go away in like less than a day. And again, the transfusion was a week afterwards. The other theory is that his body was so damaged that something called the bystander effect was happening, where free radicals of oxygen in his system were just being recycled by his system over and over again, and effectively any new cell that came into his body got damaged along with everything else. Regardless of what the reason was, Hisashi's body was so messed up that even if you gave it new cells to work with, it could not properly take care of those cells. Also around this time, on October the 15th, another major problem developed. So one of the most common causes of death of radiation sickness, besides the radiation, is gastrointestinal bleeding. So as we've established, radiation messes with your body's ability to stop bleeds. And because it also hurts your immune system, if anything gets into the body, you can get sick and die. And if anything starts to go out of the body, it's hard to stop it from going out of the body. So what happens a lot with people who experience radiation sickness is they'll start bleeding somewhere in their GI tract. And the only symptom that you can see of it is they start passing blood in their stool. And because you can't cut them open to do a surgery because, you can't have them bleeding, then they just die from that. So one of the big concerns that Mikawa had is that if Hisashi starts bleeding in his gut, they won't be able to fix it. So a gastroenterologist does an endoscope on October the 15th. The gastroenterologist later said that this was one of the most terrifying procedures of his life because any nick or scratch that he made while he was inserting the camera could be fatal. The sight they saw in Hisashi's intestines were not great. They weren't awful either, or at least not as awful as the doctors thought they might be. They were still present. All of his intestines were very tense. They said it was most likely because of the level of pain that he had been experiencing. But where there was supposed to be alveoli that are in these little folds throughout the lower intestine, they were all just smooth. However, the mucosal membrane of the lower intestine was still there. Remember, mucosal membranes are the first thing to go. However, the part of his intestine that absorbs nutrients and secretes slime is still present. This made Meikawa hopeful, because if they can get his intestines working, then they can get all sorts of nutrients into his body. It's one thing to hook up an IV and deliver nutrients to someone straight into their bloodstream. It is another to have their body working to such a degree that it can process nutrients itself. And if they need to jumpstart his body, they're going to have to get his intestines working. So, using a feeding tube that was ran through his nose as a test, they passed 100 grams of protein into his stomach. And then a few hours later, all 100 grams of those nutrients passed straight out of his body, completely unabsorbed. Not a single element of his GI tract was bringing in nutrients, meaning that for now, his entire digestive system is over. The only hope being that, again, if they can get his blood, breathing, and immune system back in order, that his body can eventually repair the damaged cells with new ones. Also, and back to, I guess, the title or thesis of this video, you could say, I cannot properly state how much pain Hisashi was going through at this time. Like, burning doesn't even come close. The feeling of every organ inside of your body losing its skin, slowly being eroded and pulled off to the point where everything quits working, and the skin outside of your body sloughing off in these giant chunks, and you can still feel every inch of it, is excruciating in a way I don't think has ever been recreated. Perhaps by other radiation victims, but again, none of them have had to endure it as long as Hisashi has. Even breathing would feel like it was ripping apart your lungs and the muscles inside of your chest. Hopefully, the painkillers were working, but at this point, he couldn't speak to confirm it, and every time the nurses would touch any part of his body, he would tense further and begin to retract limbs as much as he could. It seemed that every waking second was agony. Also during this time, if you remember, that pressure and fluid on his lungs is still there, but they can't cut into his lungs to get rid of it. So they place him on this specialized bed that effectively locks your limbs into place and begin to rotate him side to side so that he doesn't get bed sores and so that the fluid in his lungs doesn't develop into pneumonia. After seeing this one day, his wife and sister remarked and said, "Oh, honey, they've turned you into a robot." He stayed in the state of misery, pretty much continuing treatment as normal until October the 26th, whenever he began to have diarrhea. Now, if you remember, they're not putting anything through his gut, so his body is just excreting fluids through diarrhea. Now, there were two options with the diarrhea. It might have been a symptom. See, I told you this video was going to be gross. It might have been just a symptom of radiation sickness, because that's something that happens with people who have radiation exposure. But they were also afraid it might be something known as graft versus host disease, or GVHD. Graft versus host disease is kind of the opposite of your body rejecting a transplant. See, if you get something like a liver transplanted into your body, there's a chance your body can reject it and your cells begin attacking it. But if you'll remember, Hisashi doesn't really have any organs that can fight back or any immune system to attack his sister's cells that were put into his body. So the fear was that what if instead of his body rejecting the transplant, what if the transplant rejects his body and his sister's healthy cells begin to attack him? Then they've made a much bigger problem. So whenever October the 26th rolled around and he began having diarrhea, they wanted to check to make sure that this wasn't graft versus host disease. So they did another endoscopy into his intestine. And remember how 10 days earlier they said that the mucus lining was still there and they thought, oh, maybe he can digest stuff. Well, on October the 26th, nothing was there. All that was left was the smooth muscle of the intestines, with the mucus layer either completely gone or white and dead hanging down in some parts of the intestine. On the bright side, this means that he doesn't have graft versus host disease because, and again, I warned you about this being gross, because the diarrhea he was excreting were the liquefied parts of his intestines. But on the downside, it's unimaginable how his digestive tract could ever come back from this. On October the 28th, world researchers began to arrive at the Tokyo University Hospital. And keep in mind, earlier, experts were being flown in for help with treatment, but now researchers were coming in for theoretical treatment options or to observe him for what it might mean for radiation sickness in the future. Because prior to Hisashi, the longest a person had ever lived after being exposed to a criticality was 9 days. And October the 28th, Hisashi has been alive for 29 days. So these researchers not only come to give their assessment and advice, but now these global researchers are attending every meeting that's happening twice a day between Mikawa and the workers in the hospital. Around the time that the researchers got there, yet another new problem began to develop in Hisashi, and that was myoglobin concentrations in his blood. So myoglobin is a protein that is present in your muscles. And it seems that Hisashi's muscles were decomposing to such a degree that the proteins inside of the muscles were seeping out into his bloodstream. The reason this is a problem is crush syndrome is exactly what it sounds like, a syndrome that can develop after someone has been physically crushed. In instances like earthquakes, whenever parts of buildings fall down on top of people, there is a phenomenon that can happen where they are saved by a rescue crew and they had an arm or a leg get totally destroyed underneath the rubble. And they're freed and they're alive for a few days, and then suddenly they die of kidney failure. The reason being, their muscles being destroyed ground them up to such a degree that the myoglobin flows through their bloodstream, and typically myoglobin gets released through your kidneys. Everyone has a little bit of myoglobin in their blood, and it's all filtered out through your kidneys typically. But if you have a huge amount rush to your kidneys at once, it jams up your kidneys and you die of kidney failure. The normal amount of myoglobin that a human has in their blood, or at least the top end of the healthy amount that a human can have in their blood, is about 60 nanograms per milliliter. At this moment, Hisashi had 1,800. So it seems that the right hand and arm that were close to the reaction whenever it happened were decomposing and radiated to such a degree that his muscles were liquefying, and now the proteins of his muscles that are in his blood are risking shutting down his kidney. While discussing their options, the delegate from Russia, in the most Russian suggestion ever, says they should just amputate the arm. And if this was under normal circumstances, that would be true. His arm is effectively poisoning him, so you'd want to cut it off. But again, this is the guy they didn't want to do endoscopies on because they were afraid they'd nick a corner and cause him to bleed to death, so they can't cut off his arm. But effectively, his arm is melting and it's poisoning his whole body. And it seems that so much of his inner tissue was beginning to dissolve and his body was trying to pass it through his system that he was getting about 3 liters of diarrhea a day, all from the inner parts of his body just sloughing off. On top of this, regions on his body where skin had been removed, like where the tape was and on his feet, just became these blistered masses. These blisters would then pop and just begin leaking fluid from his system. A lot of the diarrhea and the fluid that was pouring out of these blisters wasn't natural to his body. He was hooked up to so many different IVs that were trying to pump his system with nutrients and fluids to keep him alive. And while some of it took, a lot of it just poured out of him. Normally, in situations like this, like for example, a burn victim, you would cut off the bad or necrotic skin that is causing this and then just graft new skin on. However, with the radiation, it was hard to tell what parts of his body were good skin and what parts were bad. And once again, you can't just like fillet the guy because then he'll bleed out. So they began to fully wrap his body with dressings and gauze. Effectively, this gauze acted like a new layer of skin because he had lost so much at this point that his body just slowly and constantly let out fluids and blood. So the gauze act as a temporary barrier. He was wrapped in so much gauze that the only parts of his body that were exposed were his eyes and the tips of his feet. His wife remarked after seeing him like this, "There's nowhere we can touch him now." Also, keep in mind that he constantly bled and seeped through these bandages, so they had to be replaced daily. It took a team of 10 people 3 hours every day to change his bandages. Another thing that the skin does that you don't really think about until you need it is regulate your body temperature. Skin works as an insulating layer that keeps all of your heat inside. But now that Hisashi has lost most of his skin, he can't regulate his body temp. So whenever they took off these bandages, there was a real threat that he would become hypothermic because all the heat would leave him. So they kept the room he was in at 86 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning this team of 10 people had to work through sweat and heat exhaustion for 3 hours straight to quickly change the bandages across his body. They also had to be super careful with how they wrapped the bandages because anywhere too tight could destroy the muscle or what little skin was still there. They would also weigh the bandages after they took it off of him because they put clean gauze on, he soaks into it overnight, and whenever they take it off the next day, the amount of fluid that's in the bandage indicates how much fluid he's lost. So at this time, he was losing about 1 liter of fluid a day through his skin. Also at this point, the lining around his eyes began to deteriorate and he started bleeding from his eyes, as well as all of his fingernails and toenails fell off. Typically, if say this was a type of burn that wasn't radioactive, they could perform a skin graft. However, they can't perform the skin graft because of the chromosome damage that his good skin does have and the whole bleed out thing. Also, he did have good skin. If you'll remember, it was the front and right side of his body that was facing the reactor. So the back left side of his body was, on the exterior, mostly intact. He still suffered the biological damage, but his outer layer of skin wasn't rotting off. So, since the sister was a match for the stem cell transplant, they decided to use her skin to grow a skin graft. This would take 2 to 4 weeks, but the sister provided a sample of her skin to be grown in a laboratory that could then be put on Hisashi. Also, the dermatologist examining him during this time noticed that on the border of the burnt skin and the OK skin, there were these tiny white dots that started to form. It turns out these dots were new skin cells. meaning that even if his body wasn't able to produce a new immune system or part of his digestive system, it seemed that eventually he could be capable of growing new skin. Even though all of the skin that he had currently was damaged, it seemed like he may be able to make healthy skin at some point in the future. Again, this is all assuming that they can keep him alive for that long. He continued with this process of bandages and fluids until in November, when he was losing about 2 liters of fluid a day just through his skin. Seeing that the problem was this bad and that he had the potential of growing new skin, they decided to set temporary skin grafts. In other words, they take skin grafts that they know probably won't take because, the donor's not exactly right, and effectively use the skin grafts as a replacement bandage. Because if they set the skin down on top of his body and it can, for at least a little while, contain some of the fluid, then maybe that can cause his body to jumpstart the rebuilding process and he can grow his own skin. So on November the 18th, again 50 days after the initial exposure, they decided to perform several temporary skin replacements. They couldn't cut his body because, again, the whole bleeding thing. So instead, his skin was so weak that they would just take like a towel or a sponge and rub parts of his skin a little bit, and all the skin would peel off. So after it was peeled off, they would then take these grafts and stitch them down on top of each other, all connected in some kind of patchwork design that would then be rejected by his body, but it seemed to last longer than the bandages and hopefully got his body to start building skin cells. All in all, Hisashi would end up going through 70 skin grafts, each lasting about 3 to 4 days. Again, this was all in an attempt to get his body to start making its own skin. But then, the same day that they were doing the skin grafts, the very thing Meikawa was afraid of happened. On November the 18th, they examined Hisashi's stool, and sure enough, it contained blood, meaning that he had a bleed somewhere in his intestines. So they do another endoscope to see how bad the damage to the intestines is, and his entire gut is just full of blood. As a matter of fact, he was excreting through his feces about 800 milliliters of blood a day. However, in the midst of this horrible information, there was a slight sign of hope. While looking at the area between his small and large intestine, there were these small white spots, which according to the gastroenterologist seemed to be new mucous membranes. Even though all of the mucous membranes had shut it off earlier and been passed through his system, it seems that his body was trying to make new ones. Similar to the skin, even though it's a crack through the clouds, it is the slight sign that if they can weather this storm, his body will eventually repair itself. So in spite of the magnitude of his injuries, this encouraged them to keep pushing forward. Until the next day, on November the 19th, when it was found that he was also bleeding into his stomach. By November the 19th, between the fluid seeping from his skin and the fluid he was excreting from his body, he was losing 10 liters of blood and fluids every day. And everywhere that was bleeding, they couldn't hope for the bleed to stop because, again, his platelet count was so low. What little repair was done by his sister's transfusion had been undone by the damage in his body. So the only thing they could do is keep pumping him full of more blood. And whatever blood went into him just came back out. He was effectively an open filter that blood and fluids just kept getting passed through. It got to the point that in one half day of the nurse's shift, they had to do 10 blood transfusions. Between this and the breathing machine and making sure he doesn't get bed sores and making sure his skin doesn't fall off and changing his bandages and everything else, it is amazing that this guy was even technically alive with all of the machines and drugs in his system. Now, it is hopeful that during this time, because of the intense level of damage done to his skin and, a lot of the systems of his body, that hopefully his nervous system quit working. But if it didn't, he would live through his body rotting. It would effectively be a conscious decomposition. Every system of his body was bleeding and burning and
cool
falling
band
apart,
name.
and he lived through
Conscious
it. Even
decomposition.
take the most brutal torture methods you've ever heard of, like the boats, where they would put someone in these two upside down boats and push them out into the water and fill them with honey so that flies would lay eggs in their body and ants would crawl inside of them, or stories of people being burned alive, or things like the brazen bull. Even in a situation like the boats where you're being eaten from the inside out, at least your arms are okay, right? At least your legs are okay. Maybe you can, the top of your head isn't burning, right? Everything hurts in here, but at least there's some extremities that are okay. And in cases where people are immolated, just burned alive, that lasts an hour at most in some cases, which is still an excruciating amount of time, but normally it's over decently fast. But with Hisashi, he had to fill every single inch of his body in constant misery, rotting and falling off. And it didn't last for a few minutes. It didn't last for an hour. By the end of this, it lasted for 83 days. There isn't a single more painful, brutal death that I could imagine. Maybe there are worse deaths, depending on your definition of worse. Maybe there's, genocides that have been committed that are tragic, or horrible stories of,
No
say,
problem,
children
Woody.
taken before their time, and things that we might say are worse. But as far as painful, I can't think and don't want to think of a scenario that tops this: watching your body rot while you're still in it. In spite of all of this, his family remained hopeful. His family still came to see him at every single visitation. They'd walk up to him and talk about how strong and how brave he was. And the doctors would talk to him constantly. Every time the nurses came to change his bandages, they would still speak to him. They talk about what the weather was like, what was happening in news or politics in the country. They always maintained that he was the same person now that he was when he was talking about fishing and how much he loved his wife the first week he arrived. The question that a lot of nurses and a lot of doctors were asking at the time is this right? How long do we keep this man alive? And I want to dispel a rumor right now. Whenever you read about this case, a lot of the narrative around it is that, oh, these crazy scientists were keeping him alive against his will, and he kept begging to die, but they kept doing more tests and wanted to perform more experiments. And that's not what happened. This case has a lot of weird misinformation about it too, by the way. Like, for example, there's a picture of a guy laying in a bed with his arms and legs up who's like burn all over. And anywhere you Google, they're like, yep, that's a picture of Hisashi Uchi. It's not. That is the picture from a medical textbook about burn treatments. A news reporter probably, or someone online said that was Hisashi, and everyone else just ran with it. It was like, yep, that's a picture of the irradiated man, but it's not. It's just a burn victim. I think it's because people weirdly want to sensationalize this story, but it doesn't need it beyond, what it already is. It's already such a tragic tale, but they make it into like, here's a picture of his body mangled, and the doctors kept performing experiments. And it's weird. But the tone I got out of every doctor from every interview was this constant struggle of them knowing that they need to perform their jobs, that they assured Hisashi they're going to keep him alive as long as they can, that they assured the family they're going to keep him alive as long as they can, and then coming to see the state he's in and wondering if they're trying to play God. And also, at the end of the day,
Yeah, that's what they're fucking doing. They're playing the fucking torturous god that made this fucking universe, keeping someone alive for no reason. If your job is to keep someone tortured, you need to quit your fucking job. I mean, respect their efforts of have the willpower to maintain their, job, whatever the job may be. If you're a soldier in battle, I want you to maintain your position, but if your fucking position is unnecessary torture, keeping someone alive for zero hope, so that they can take care of their family. Amount of tax dollars you spend torturing this man for 83 days, you could have taken care of this entire fucking bloodline for multiple generations over. It's not that. It's just experimentation, blind hope, primitive desires. Has no logic behind it.
hey, these doctors weren't doing anything beyond the standard. Because the way it is with radiation victims is you just have to survive the symptoms, and then their body will come out of it. And as drastic as the symptoms have been, would it be better for the doctors to say, oh, well, he's costing too much blood transfusions, or his body seems too damaged in this area, we should just let him die? Some of the nurses thought to themselves that, yeah, maybe we should just let him die. Maybe that's what would be best. But regardless of
Probably.
this, the doctors doubled down and said, our job is to keep him alive, because as horrible as these symptoms can be, as long as there is a micro chance to save him, as long as the walls of his intestines may grow back, as we've seen evidence of, and some of his skin may grow back, then it's worth the time. It's worth most of the doctors living in the hospital. It's worth doing several 2-hour meetings a day and then going to his family and explaining what happened. It's worth 3 hours of bandage changes. It's worth some of the medical residents who were there having to type up 2 8-page reports a day to present to all of the doctors. It's worth the countless hours to save his life if there's a chance. And obviously, I can't speak for Hisashi, but knowing that with the last words he said before he was intubated, when he saw his family and they told him to stay strong for them, and he saw his wife and his son, and he just gritted his teeth and bared it, I like to think that that was his answer. Because a lot of people say, well, Hisashi couldn't speak. Maybe he wanted to die. Maybe he wanted to slip on. And yeah, with the pain he experienced, I wouldn't blame him if at some point he did. But I like to think that right before they intubated him and he agreed to push forward for his family and told his wife that he loved her, I like to think that that was his answer, that even if there was a chance that he could stay alive for them, that he'd suffer through it. And if I was in that position, If I decided that I'm willing to endure whatever pain or cost there was to stay alive for my family, then I would hope that I had a team of doctors as adamant and loyal as Hisashi did. And also, what again, everything you read about this, they're like the evil doctors who kept a man alive and wouldn't let him die. Like, do people see this story of a guy who spent 83 days and a whole team of doctors and then fighting against, the disease that was all over him? And are they like, not interested enough? But if the doctors were evil, if we make the doctors into like these comic book villains, that's a story. And during this time, the doctors were trying to do everything they could for the pain. He was on a mix of propofol, fentanyl, and ketamine hydrochloride. The doses he was taking was about the same of someone who would be awake during open brain surgery. And despite the strength of that, it is likely that they began to lose their effectiveness as he was introduced to more and more painkillers over the days that followed. But again, the only thing they can do is treat the symptoms and hope that he comes out of it. Also, with this insane amount of drugs constantly pumping through his system, his heart was having a hard time getting any circulation to his extremities. So he maintained a heart rate of about 120 from October onwards. Effectively, this guy's heart was constantly running a marathon with no breaks for over a month. As they were maintaining his condition, on November the 27th, which was day 59 since exposure, on November the 27th at 7:01 a.m., Mikawa was walking down the hallway and looked into Hisashi's room and saw that his blood pressure was 40/30. For those that don't know, a healthy blood pressure is 80/120, which meant that Hisashi's heart was about to give out. Mikawa rushed into the room, called a code, got a ton of people in there, and they immediately began giving CPR. See, normally, Hisashi was hooked up to dozens of different devices that constantly monitored his heart rate and would alert the entire hospital if he was to have a heart attack or if his system was to stop or anything like that. But about an hour before, they had removed a lot of the equipment to do x-rays. And while the current technicians were down the hallway looking at the x-ray pictures, it was the one window of time that his system could have stopped and all of the doctors wouldn't have been around to get it restarted. And if it hadn't been for Mikawa just walking by, no one would have noticed it, or at least not noticed it before it was too late. When they ran into the room, he wasn't breathing and didn't have a heartbeat. So again, they began performing CPR and delivered epinephrine. So his heart initially stopped at 7:01 a.m. At 7:10, his heart starts again. At 7:25, it stops again. At 7:34, it starts again. At 7:50, it stops again. Then finally, at 8:14, it starts and maintains a blood pressure of 125/86 and 164 beats per minute. All in all, Hisashi died 3 times and his heart was stopped for a total of 49 minutes. Now, typically, that would cause undisputable massive brain damage. But because Hisashi was still hooked up to so many pumps that were effectively helping his heart run blood through his system for him, they figured that enough blood stayed in his brain that it didn't just make him brain dead. They ran tests to confirm, but it seems that while on a normal person, 49 minutes of no heartbeat would kill you, on Hisashi, it seemed to not, although he almost definitely got significant brain damage from it. Hopefully, he did experience brain damage enough that he wasn't conscious for a lot of the pain that followed, because one of the things that happened immediately following his heart
Imagine
stopping
being like a
was his kidneys
blessing, your
stopped
brain damage.
entirely. So they had to hook him up to a dialysis machine that ran 24/7 as his new kidneys. His blood work also showed that he was about to undergo liver failure as well. Mikawa gave the information to Hisashi's family, who, remember, is still living in the waiting room on the first floor. And after telling them everything that happened, they said, even if his heart stopped, it started again. He'll get better. During this time, the family would visit Hisashi and tell him to hang in there and that he's being so strong that they're all proud of him. Perhaps to support the idea that he didn't suffer a lot after that series of heart attacks, while his brain showed that there was still activity, he no longer responded to stimuli. He no longer would grab their hand or move his eyes or nod or anything like that. He seemed to be completely vegetative, which leads to 2 options. One, he was effectively dead at that point and didn't feel anything, which would be, the much kinder option. The other option is that now, on top of all of the pain and suffering, he can't move at all. Some of the nurses said that every now and then there would be like the move of an eyebrow or the slight tinge in a finger or toe, but they couldn't be sure if that was just like an involuntary action or if that was him still in there. Also, it seemed at this point that his heart was entirely ran by medication. Because anytime that they tried to stifle him off the medication to see how he did, his heart would immediately start to tank in blood pressure and they had to crank it back up. So there is a possibility that his body was effectively dead, but the vasopressors and other drugs they were running to like keep pressure in his heart was just causing the chemical reactions to keep happening. Or again, the horrifying alternative that he was conscious for all of this. On December the 1st, after 63 days in, yet another problem occurs when it's found out that he has hemophagocytosis. This is a condition where the macrophages in your blood, part of your immune system, starts eating your blood. So this required that he have a full plasma transfusion, which he did. Typically in plasma transfusions, the max you'll see is eight units of plasma. He had to have 75. A complete plasma replacement that took 3 days to do. On December the 7th, at 3 p.m., shortly after the transfusion, his body once again went into shock, where he was administered more epinephrine to come back out of it. At the same time, his white blood cell count dipped back down to 1,000, where it was at 10,000. So most of the good that was done by the original stem cell transfusion had been undone. And at this point, he was entirely automated. From needing new blood to new immunities in his blood, to blood transfusions in his lungs and his heart and his blood flow. And every aspect of his body was automated to some degree. Even his kidneys were now a box that's set across the room from him. So Meikawa, who has been entirely dependent this entire time on keeping this man alive because there is a chance that he will get better, after seeing the evidence that his heart is just a box that drugs are keeping running, and after seeing that every aspect of his body that still works is trying to kill the rest of it, like the hemophagocytosis, and needs replaced by something else, and they just keep changing out skin and blood and bandages, that he's effectively just a robot, a marionette that they keep running more strings through. And on December the 19th at 11:30 p.m., 81 days in, Meikawa came to the conclusion that they shouldn't do anymore. He goes to the family and he takes them into an office that has all of Hisashi's vitals and stats and charts and everything laid out on computer screens, and takes hours explaining to them in detail why every single thing is happening. Well, this drug affects this and this pressure affects this, to help them fully understand exactly where they are at, to understand that at this point, Hisashi is not Hisashi. He is a body that is controlled by other things. And he concludes and says, the next time that his heart stops, we shouldn't try to start it again. And after hearing all of this, the family simply replies, we understand. There's a lot of malice around the family in this story as well. Like whenever you read reports about it, there was like the evil doctors and the selfish family. That's the tone everyone has. Like, oh, his family was like, we don't care if he won't make it. Keep torturing him. It's like the way, again, people, I keep saying people, weird YouTube channels and content farm news outlets. Okay, that's who I mean by people. But it's because they always want everything to be so two-dimensional. They don't want to talk about nuance or, the terror of, do I keep a family member alive or not? But up until this point, it has never been impossible for him to live. At some point, the radiation...
Living's not exactly a beneficial thing. Pro-mortalist, everybody knows that here. But yeah, when he's going through that level of statistical odds stacked against him and that much of guaranteed agony, yeah, it's just kind of like, it's a guaranteed selfish decision. You're putting a person through torture worse than death, guaranteed, for the hope that I guess they might come out on top of it for what, like, so they can die 20 years down the line from cancer again. Yeah, it's like, it's selfish. You can call it otherwise. You can say the terror of being without a father, whatever, blah, blah, blah. There are calculations you can make about pain that are quite obvious, especially in cases like this, where it's like, yeah, no. Living without a father or having your father get tortured for 83 days. Yeah, it's a pretty easy utilitarian calculation.
Symptoms would stop and he would be able to live. And like, could you imagine how different this story would be if he did live? If this guy went through 20 sieverts of exposure and lived, came out of it on the other side, and despite all of these transfusions and monsters,
and then he would have died something a couple of years later. Yeah, great for him.
He got to raise his son. Like, no one would be like, oh, why'd you keep him alive then? It's only because it didn't work that they feel this way. And keep in mind, this had never happened before. Someone was never exposed to this much and stayed living. Perhaps because it stayed living, something about his body was strong enough. Something could beat it. It could be a breakthrough for radiation exposure for eons to come. But it's because he didn't live that everyone gets pointed a finger at. The medical team gets called monsters. The family gets called selfish. But this entire time, it was just a family, a wife who wanted to keep her husband alive, a son who wanted to see his dad. That was it. And I hate a lot of the tones that get put around him because they're like, he begged.
The best intentions pave the pathway to hell. every child born usually is born out of love. Not all of them. Some people literally born their children to sell them into sex slavery or whatever. You know, I'm not gonna deny that some people are just pieces of shit. But most people, their intention of having a child is love. But they don't really acknowledge the fact that there's a 1 in 6 chance their daughter gets raped, a 1 in 5 chance their daughter will die of cancer, 1 in 106 chance they'll get crushed by a car in a motor vehicle accident. You can start naming diseases. You can start naming other deformities, mental disorders. 10% chance that they, well, a couple years ago it was like a 10% chance of like depression before COVID, I guess. Now it's like closer to 50%. Uh, 1-2% for schizophrenia, 1% for 1 to 3% for psychopathy. You know, it's just like we can go on the list forever. You're taking a fucking gamble, and they're guaranteed a fucking bad sentence. It's all these choices are selfish. The intentions, peachy, yes. Beautiful for them, yes. Costly, oh fucking boy.
For death, but his family wouldn't let him go. They would just go to his bedside and tell him to stay strong, to keep fighting. Because, you know, if there was a chance that someone you loved could live, wouldn't you want them to keep pushing?
No, I
And
wouldn't.
again, maybe somewhere in his broken state of being, he decided that he wanted to go. Again, I wouldn't blame him. But, man, the family is not evil for wanting to save him. And the doctors are not evil for trying to. And it's really heartbreaking that the story gets kind of seen that way. Because on
Evil, no. Selfish, yes.
all ends, it was a tragedy that this had to be experienced. Any of this happened in the first place. And I think a lot of the malice people attribute to the family is done away with in the simple lines they said to Meikawa when they said, "We understand. You've done everything you can. You've gone above and beyond to save Hisashi. And now you're telling us that you shouldn't try to save him again. And we did it." The next day, the 82nd day, on December the 20th, the family came in to have their final goodbye, effectively, or in case something happens, their final goodbye. They hadn't seen his face since the doctors had put bandages over them. So the nurses decided that they were going to take off the bandages and put T-Rex gauze down, which is much thinner, so they could kind of see an outline of his face. You know, at this point, super care about, you know, infections or anything that comes isn't as important. So they clean him up as much as they can to see his family. And whenever the family walks into the room and sees his face, a lot of them begin crying. A lot of them, at least, except for his wife, who still maintains her strength. They begin thanking the staff, saying that he looks great, that they cleaned him up, and that they appreciate them putting on the lower gauze so that they could get an outline of his face, because they knew they didn't have to do that, but they appreciated the gesture. Also, during this time, his poor blood circulation stopped the antifungals he was taking from working, and he had developed a fungus, or a fungus began to develop on him known as aspergillus, which feeds on fluids excreted from the body. So in the mix of all of this charred looking flesh and blood, he had this whitish gray mold that began growing around his torso.
Basically, at this point, he's a corpse. There's no more suffering. So, from a utilitarian point of view, as I'm a utilitarian, the tragedy only remains in the eyes of the remaining lives, aka the family and us who bear witness to such tragedies alive today. So, let that sit with you a little bit. That you know, our reflection of his pain is just a fraction, a drop. But when it comes down to it, let's get into more interesting things. Yay! A story that people haven't really heard of, but is also brutal as fuck, and another cost of history: war. I personally am very deeply saddened by war, just because it's kind of like a trickery played upon by one's own government to sacrifice your autonomy, what little you have, to destroy the enemy, your brother, your fellow Homo sapien divided by artificial borders, torn apart because of ideologies and greed. You know, so it upsets me greatly. War does. It's kind of deeply fucked. What's little semblance of, we don't have free will, but like ability to have an effect in the universe is just being hijacked by a governmental force to gain riches and land. So let's get into the pain of war. Because don't we love that? Okay, actually, you know what? I'm gonna give you two options for pain of war. The most brutal fucking thing that's so fucking fucked up that you actually might actually have a little bit of a mental breakdown just a tiny bit, or one that's interesting and pretty metal as fuck, like actually kind of dope in a way. Like it's brutal as shit for the people that gone through it, but in a way it's kind of awesome as shit as well. Like it's like a cool story. Like if I was my grandpa, I'd be like, yeah, it fucking sucked. Like I really wish that he didn't have to go through that. But god damn, is he a badass? Or a story so fucking tragic that it literally just makes you hate this world and every fiber of being in it, and the cost of existence you realize is so fucking high that it's just like, wow, what the hell? If these two last stories haven't done that, then, the torture of 40,000 plus Chinese civilians, or the radiation guy, if that hasn't put your mind into extreme cacophony of depression already, we can hype it up a little bit more by just going to this story. Right, where is it? I love this story. It's just really fucking messes you up. All is quiet on the Western Front. They just turned it into they just turned All is Quiet into Western Front into a modern movie. It's pretty good. But let's just say All is Quiet in the Western Front, the traditional one, it's just a story in its raw form of like representation of World War One. Yeah, it's fucking brutal. Just to say World War One is it's horror beyond horror when it comes to war. The war to end all wars. The war to end all wars. So what you want to the war to end all wars, or where is it? I could have swore it was around here. There's a lot of Wendigoon videos I haven't watched actually. Now I think about it. Or we could watch something fun. We don't know how bad those steps are. Like if science had a measuring device, it would destroy the measuring device. Yeah, basically chaos. It would, if science could measure pain, if we could measure the pain of World War One, the device would just explode like not even like a fraction into like the total measurement of suffering. It would just erupt. Shrapnel would fly into the scientist's face and just put them out of their fucking misery for even attempting to scientifically understand suffering to such a scale, try to quantify such misery. There'd be some cosmic force would shove the shrapnel right into their brain stems as punishment. Just kidding. But fuck. World War One's a brutal as fuck thing. You know what? Yeah, we're watching that. It's 1 hour perfectly, basically.
Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be discussing one of the most controversial, impactful, and disturbing black and white movies ever made, All Quiet on the Western Front. The story of this film and the people who made it have set it apart in film history as one of the most important movies ever made. And to understand why that is, we need to look at the story itself. All Quiet on the Western Front was adapted from a book titled In the West, Nothing New by author Eric Remarque. Eric was a German soldier during World War I who fought on the Western Front against France and Britain. In the book, he used a fictional character by the name of Paul to use as a stand-in for himself and the horrors that he saw during his time at war. The book was first published in 1928, just 10 years after World War I ended, and then 2 years after that, in 1930, it was then made into a movie by Universal Studios. The world politics of 1930 were complicated to say the least. Again, World War I had just ended, and it wouldn't be too long before World War II began. So during this time, director Louis Milestone, who himself was a veteran of World War I, decided to make a movie about this novel written by a German soldier. He didn't stop there, as nearly all of the extras and several of the cast and crew were veterans of the war themselves. So, at a time when propaganda was prevalent in order to maintain morale for one's country and military, they decided to make a film that would show audiences at large, for the first time, what war was really like. As you can imagine, that led to a lot of backlash, but we'll talk about that later. For now, I want to go through the movie itself, break down several of the scenes as well as the plot, and get across to you why it's so disturbing and why it's so important. Because at a time in history when everyone's patriotism to their own country was in such prevalence, this group of American veterans decided to make a film about the horrors of war as seen by German soldiers. And using experiences across continents, they joined together to send one message: war is hell. Perhaps nothing sums up the movie and the book better than the message that appears at the beginning of both. This story is neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all, an adventure. For death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped its shells, were destroyed by the war. I'm also going to give a warning now. Despite being made in 1930, this movie has some very brutal depictions and bloody depictions of the war, so if that's something you're sensitive to, you may want to sit this one out. Why, hello there. If you're wondering what I'm doing tired on this much lower quality camera, it's because I am at my limit. I have attempted to upload the video you are currently watching 7 times at this point, with this current version being. So if all of that sounds interesting to you in a dark, brutal, semi-depressing sort of way, which, welcome to the channel, then stick around as we break down All Quiet on the Western Front. But before we do that, let's hear from someone who is, surprisingly, in a much darker place than I am right now. Why, hello there. You're probably wondering what I'm doing in the great outdoors, and the answer is I'm simply enjoying the magic of nature. And you know what's the most magical gift nature has to offer us? That is right. Today's sponsor, for the title card that I mentioned in the intro, we cut to 2 people discussing the state of the German army at the beginning of World War I. As they open the doors and we cut to the street, the tone is quickly established. The German army marching off to war are treated as heroes. Dates and specific battles are never mentioned in this movie for reasons I'll talk about later, but we see that this is taking place at the beginning of the war. A postman delivering mail mentions that tomorrow he'll be going off to be a sergeant in the military. The man he's talking to responds that he will in a few months as well, but the war will probably be over by then. In the meantime, we see women hugging the men as they leave and throwing flowers at them as they march through the streets as a sort of parade. They're playing drums and trumpets to establish the might of these heroes. The entire scene feels like a fairy tale, and it's supposed to. These men are supposed to be depicted as larger than life and untouchable, the way that people of the time wanted to view the heroes of war. Hold these images and the idea of this in your mind for when we see this same street later in the film. We then see a classroom with the windows wide open, listening to the sounds of the parade as the teacher is urging the young men on to enlist now. The teacher speaks of how much these young boys are needed and how the fatherland cannot persist without their sacrifice. He mentions that others are joining as well, and schools have had to be shut down because all of the boys went off to war. The teacher even directly mentions their parents, saying what kind of father would be so selfish as to not give up a son for his nation, and what kind of mother would be too weak to not send a son for her country. The men hearing this begin to envision what their idea of war is. They imagine the cheers and glory they'll receive as these proud warriors stepping out to fight for their people. They imagine the women adoring them and the prestige that comes with enlisting. Then the teacher begins to call on them specifically, asking why certain individuals haven't enlisted yet. One of the boys he points to is named Paul, and he says that Paul is a young writer. Again, the story In the West Nothing New was written by Eric Remarque. However, Paul was his self-insert for the story. So the experience of Paul is the experience that Eric had in World War I. After enough prodding, Paul stands up and says that he will go to fight for his country, and with that, the rest of the class joins in.
I wonder what you are going to do. I'll go. I want to go. Count on me. Me too. I'm ready. I'm not going to stay home.
They all begin to cheer and shout as the camera cuts between the smiling and yelling faces of the boys and the proud, happy face of their teacher. The boys begin to say things that are laughably and sadly juvenile, like now they don't have to go to class anymore. One boy in the class, a boy by the name of Ben, has not yet decided to enlist. So his friends join around him specifically, and after enough convincing, Ben says that he'll enlist as well. With that, the whole class begins cheering and singing as they throw paper into the air and say they'll march together to go enlist. On the chalkboard behind the professor, there's a few phrases written. One of them is the opening to Homer's Odyssey. Tell me, O muse, of that ingenious hero who traveled far and wide. Again, mixing with the ideas that these boys have that they're going to be great heroes who will be sung about and told through the epic poems of history. But after that comes a couple phrases that are harbingers for the story to come. The first reads, "Resist the first elements of passion. It's too late when you resort to medicine." And a third phrase that appears at the end of the scene says, "Whatever you do, do it wisely and keep in mind your purpose." Again, this introduction shows us the arrogant adventure of war and how these boys are ready to fight, although they don't yet understand what that means. For many who never fought in World War I, the scene exemplifies their experience of the war. To join is to be a hero, and to fight is righteous. And what sets All Quiet on the Western Front apart from other movies at the time is that this is where the fairy tale ends. The story leads us into that revelation slowly, and for now, we get the first hints of it when the boys go to boot camp. Also, I know I haven't really named any of the characters besides Paul. There's like 6 of the boys who are the main characters throughout the story, but if I was to just throw out a bunch of German names right now, would it mean anything to you? So as people become relevant, then I'll give them a name. While in boot camp, the boys are talking about how excited they are to start fighting and to learn bayonet drills or how to shoot a rifle. The first dose of reality comes whenever their former mailman, Himmel, the guy shown in conversation at the introduction of the movie, steps into the bunk as their drill sergeant. At first, the boys treat him the way they treat each other, saying they're happy to see him as a friend. But Himmel, who's all about order and following orders, decides to put them in line. He has them march for hours and hours on end and crawl through the mud on their stomachs. This quickly establishes that the war isn't going to be as fun as they thought it would be. Also, during this time, we start to get a glimpse of how impressive the cinematography and the sets are for this movie. Like in 1930, to get shots like this and coordinate movements of this size is very impressive. I mean, it's impressive by today's standards as well. It's just super impressive for back then. Also, nearly every extra that you see on screen is a real German veteran. Louis Milestone wanted to ensure that the film had authenticity, so the majority of the training drills and the tactics that you see employed later in the film were taught to him by German soldiers. So in scenes like this, you're just watching Germans do what they did in the war. Because of Himmel's continued strictness, the boys decide to play a prank on him. They catch him out one night, wrap him in a bedcloth, and then throw him in a bunch of mud. Also, this has nothing to do with the overbearing plot or themes of the movie, but the scream Himmel makes when they grab him is hilarious. Like legit, that gets me every time. After this, the boys are sent out to fight and finally begin to make their way to the front lines. Also, this will be my last movie nerd moment for this review. Actually, it won't be at all, but just to do it again. These shots of looking through the window and seeing this group of men walk forward and kind of being detached from the reality they're facing and then cutting back to them in person, it's gorgeous. I love it. Shortly after the boys step off the train, they are met with artillery fire. A soldier, unrelated to our main group, is killed by the ensuing shrapnel. Ben, who, if you'll remember, was the boy who needed convincing from the rest of his friends, lays by this soldier's side and, despite Paul's urging, has trouble letting go of this fallen comrade. This is the first death that they've seen, and it happened before they even had a chance to fight back. Paul and his group continues until they meet up with the company that they're supposed to join into. The small group of soldiers who they're essentially refilling are the survivors of previous battles, meaning Paul and his friends are the recruits stepping in to work with seasoned soldiers. This is made apparent whenever they are very abrasive to Paul when he accidentally sets his stuff at a bunk one of them was already using.
That's me. I vested. And this is where he lives. I didn't know. Well, you know now. Yes, of course.
The boys remark that they're hungry, and after Paul asks where the food is, the men laugh, saying food's pretty much non-existent out here. Hunger is a reoccurring problem throughout the story, and it becomes apparent that the soldiers are very undersupplied. We see this as the group's only way of achieving food is through my favorite character in the movie, Cat. Cat is not only the group's leader, but you can also tell that he's been through a lot of war and is very much over it at this point. You can see this as the way he gets food for the group is by stealing an entire pig. And then in the following scene, whenever he returns to the group of soldiers, they see him as a superior officer and stand at attention, and Cat gets scared because that hasn't happened in so long and stands at attention with them. Before he tells them that that's stupid and don't do that again. And then whenever Cat's friends see that all he brought back was one pig, he says that he'd wish they'd just die already.
Are you crazy? There ain't enough here for us.
I wish you three would get bumped off. I'm tired of feeding you for nothing.
Cat is, as you can see, used for a lot of comedic relief, but he's also the cornerstone that the boys use to navigate throughout the film. As terrible things happen, Cat is constantly there to reassure them that it's not their fault and it's just a part of the war. In a weird way, he's sort of our straight man for a lot of the horrors we experience, because if he can witness all of this and still be okay, then maybe the others have a chance as well. After this, the group is deployed for their first job, wiring duty. World War I, for those who aren't familiar, was primarily determined through trench warfare. Along these trenches, barbed wire was continuously placed in order to stop any oncoming attack. Now, you can't do this during the daytime because the potential attackers will, kill you for it. So at night, soldiers would quietly sneak out of the trenches in order to lay barbed wire. As they get off the truck to go to the front lines, there's this shot where several of the boys look back at the truck leaving as a sort of final send-off before their way home is gone forever. Keep this shot in mind for later. On their way to the lines, Kat begins to tell the boys about artillery and what it sounds like and that they shouldn't be afraid of it. Whenever artillery fire begins, all the boys jump to the ground, and Ben, who's already at his wits' end, wets himself. Kat looks at him and says it's okay, that it's happened to better men, and as a matter of fact, it's happened to Kat himself.
Yeah, never mind. It's happened to better men than you. And it's happened to me. When we come back, I'll get you all some nice, clean underwear.
This is what I mean by he's always using his own experience in order to get the boys through it. Something interesting about this scene where they crawl out into the mud in order to lay the wire, the director went to his group of extras, which were essentially all German soldiers, and asked them to teach him how they laid out barbed wire. So these German veterans instructed the cast of how to lay out barbed wire, and several of the extras in the scene are people who did that during the war. And another interesting thing about the scene that holds no real value is this comedically large hammer that I think is very funny. While they're out there, the flares launch
comedically
before
large
artillery
hammer.
and gunfire begin. They all make it back to the trench except for Ben, who gets caught out in the
Hey,
field,
how's it going?
and he is then blinded by ensuing explosions. And for audiences in the 1930s, who obviously knew that people died in war, but perhaps never considered the harrowing nature of battle, this scene was a shock.
My eyes! My eyes! I can't see it!
As Ben begins to run the wrong direction, he is cut down by gunfire. One of the boys, Kimmerich, decides to go save him. After bringing Ben back and laying him in the trench, Kat asks Kimmerich why he would do that. Kimmerich says that it's his friend, it's Ben. And Kat says,
How I play is through a website called Foundry and also D&D Beyond. D&D Beyond allows me to create my characters, and then Foundry is the platform that we use as like a playmat, essentially, and we can roll our dice from.
it's just a corpse, and definitely not worth your life. This is in stark contrast to everything that the boys had been taught. Sure, they knew that it was possible to die in the war, but even then there was this valor to it, and the idea that everyone is treated as heroes, even in death. But as they stand in front of no man's land, and a field of bodies, both friend and enemy, who no one can bring back home, the valor begins to fade. We then see that the group is staying in a dugout on the front lines, as artillery fire is constant through every hour of every day. The ground rattles and shakes, and there are rats running between their feet. They mentioned that this has been going on for 5 days, and Kat says 2 more makes a week, and then you can say that you've really been under fire. Again, Kat continues to be the foundation for the rest of the group. An officer steps into the dugout and mentions that 2 other dugouts have been wiped out, which is not what this group wants to hear. The officer's very casual and remarks that he'll try to get the boys some food, as they've been several days without eating. Through the scene, you can see the madness and paranoia on the faces of these men. Things like shell shock and PTSD were just now stepping into the public consciousness. And just as earlier with Ben's death, if you were watching this movie in 1930 and not yet considered the horrors of trench warfare, then this scene would also be a shock. To keep him from screaming and trying to run away, Kat knocks out Kimrick. However, a few moments later, when Kat's distracted, Kimrick tries to make a run for it. He runs through the trenches and tries to go over the top before artillery fire takes him out. He's still alive and is carried behind the lines to a field hospital. After this, we see that the men get a loaf of bread and have to fight over it not only between each other, but the rats in the trench as well. Then shortly after this, and after days of bombardment, the shelling stops, which means that the French are about to attack. The men quickly line up on the trench and place their rifles over the top, waiting for the French to arrive. Some of the shots in this scene of the men in the trenches and the quiet of no man's land are incredible. Scenes like this are really structured like a horror movie. There's this tension that builds up as the men are aiming down their sights in a moment they've waited months for at this point, anticipating the Allies to rise out of their trench and come attack them. Finally, as the French begin to charge, German artillery begins to fire back, and hundreds are killed before they ever get a shot off. There's this scene as Paul is watching this unfold. He sees a French soldier reach up to the barbed wire and wrap his hands around it to try to pull himself up before he is hit by an explosive directly, and whenever the smoke clears, all that's left are his 2 hands gripping the wire. It turns out that this shot came directly from one of the German extras who were working on the movie. While discussing the trench scene, one of the German extras mentions that during the beginning of an engagement, he had watched a French soldier grab onto the barbed wire, get blown up, and all that was left were his hands hanging on the wire. and Lewis Milestone felt that this was impactful enough to recreate it in the film. I think about these hands a lot because there was a real French soldier who fought in World War I who died in an instant, quicker than he could process it, and all that was left of him were his disembodied hands. So a soldier on the enemy side who witnessed that would survive the war and years later speak to an American filmmaker about his hands, and that filmmaker would immortalize those hands forever. All from a soldier who could not have possibly known what his legacy would be. It's bizarre to think about that this soldier, with his final moments in a future he couldn't have possibly envisioned, perhaps did more to fight warfare itself than one soldier ever could have. And of course, the most impactful part is that that is one of millions who died in World War I, and so many bodies left on battlefields that have their own stories to tell. But the idea of these two hands physically above the battlefield, separated from everyone else, and that being the legacy of one life taken of many, there's something about it. The Germans begin to shoot back with belt-fed machine guns and bolt-action rifles. Eventually, the French make their way to the German trenches and begin to engage in hand-to-hand combat. They fight with bayonets and knives and shovels in their fists. In 1930, it was considered pretty obscene to depict someone dying by any manner on camera. And here we have a brutal, violent fight, even by today's standards. The way these men are depicted, men who we've seen both in moments of laughter and terror, now with these grizzled faces as they begin to plunge knives into men whose name they'll never know, is a lot by today's standards, and in 1930, earth-shattering. Because at the time, while the general public loved the idea and the glory of the soldier, they didn't want to think about the brutality of it, or the menacing nature of warfare itself. I mean, it's the same thing by today's standards, right? When's the last time you saw a military recruitment campaign that showed actual warfare? It's always just the cool guy hero shots and college for some reason. Audiences at the time loved the idea of the blood, guts, and glory of war, as long as you leave out the blood and guts, where All Quiet on the Western Front just left out the glory. The Germans evacuate and run from the French before the French are stopped by German artillery fire, and the retreat is flipped. There's a shot as the French are shooting at the advancing Germans, and we see a sort of camera track down the trench line as the men are being cut down. And what's important about this scene is it is a direct one-to-one mirror of the same scene we saw depicted when the Germans were shooting the French. The two shots, aside from direction, are nearly identical to each other. It's as if the only difference is the direction they're walking and the uniform they're wearing. As the survivors of the battle are relieved by the advancing cavalry, the men have a moment to rest. From the remains on the battlefield, they cut blood from bread and break open bottles of wine in a moment of rest. The next day, whenever the men get to walk behind lines in order to get some real food, the chef tries to stop them, saying that he's made food for 150 people and asks why only 80 are here. And that's because of the 150 men in the company, only 80 have survived. There's a short fight. Cat threatens to kill the chef, which is pretty standard for him.
None of us backbone that ever drew a cook like her. And you're scared to show. All we want to hear out of you is one more little yip and we'll cut you up and eat you raw.
Before an officer breaks it up and the men get to eat. The men have a conversation about why they're here in the first place. And I understand by today's standards, this isn't anything earth-shattering like, oh, war bad, how controversial. But in 1930, while certainly not a new debate by any means, it certainly wasn't as loud. So when the men say things like,
me and the Kaiser felt just alike about this war. We didn't either of us want any war, so I'm going home. He's there already.
Somebody must have wanted it. Maybe it was the English. No, I don't want to shoot any Englishmen. I never saw one till I came up here. And I suppose most of them never saw a German till they came up here. No, I'm sure they weren't asked about it.
Well, it must be doing somebody some good.
Not me and the Kaiser.
I think maybe the Kaiser wanted a war.
You leave us out of this.
I don't see that. The Kaiser's got everything he needs.
Well, they never had a war before. Every full-grown emperor needs one war to make him famous. Why, that's history.
Yeah, generals too.
Sure.
They need war.
Manufacturers, they get rich.
it goes a long way. Neither side wanted the war, and aside from kings, generals, and businessmen, it seems that no one's winning either. The boys go to see Kimrick. If you'll remember, he's the one who ran out of the trench and was injured by mortar fire before the main battle began. When they get there, Kimrick says that he feels a sharp pain in his foot, but when the men look down, his foot's been amputated. This sends Kimrick into a whirlwind, as he feels he'll never be able to walk the same again. His friend Mueller is immediately like, oh, those are some cool boots you got, since you won't be needing them.
If you're not going to be using these, Franz, why don't you leave them with us? What good are they to you? I can use them. My boots give me blister after blister.
And while that may sound very cold to say to someone who just lost a foot, it's more so the boyish ignorance that these kids have. He doesn't recognize the psychological damage or the weight of what's happening. He's just a kid who likes his friend's boots. Paul stays by Kimrick's side, and after remarking that Kimrick will get better,
I don't think so.
Kimrick says that he won't, and to give his boots to Mueller and send his watch back home. Paul tries to get a doctor to help, saying that the patient with an amputation is in trouble. The doctor remarks that he's done over a dozen amputations today, and he's got another one to go do right now. People are dying constantly. To the hospital, Kimrick's another cot that needs to be refilled. And whenever we see Paul leave the hospital while holding Kimrick's boots, we know that Kimrick didn't make it. There's this interesting series of shots where we see that Mueller gets the boots, and while wearing them, he gets killed. We then see the boots go on to another soldier, and then while wearing them, he gets killed. And it's not to say that perhaps the boots are some bad omen, at least not directly, but more so just the idea that these soldiers keep dying and their equipment's lasting longer than they are. It's just to show that boys keep dying and the war keeps marching on. While the group is again in another dugout, we hear that a man got a letter from his wife at home and begins to feel homesick that a woman shouldn't have to take care of a farm by herself, and he really wants to get back to her. Keep this guy in mind for later. At the same time, Himmel, the drill sergeant and previous mailman from the beginning of the movie, shows up to the trenches. This is his first time on the front lines. And here, as soon as he tries his whole bossy stand at attention thing, they don't care for it.
Who's your friend?
Would somebody get General Ludendorff a nice, comfortable chair?
Come on, George, your superior officer. Do you want to be caught by surprise?
I do. It's going to be a big attack tonight, and I just love to get on it.
Will you obey my orders?
Yes, the positivity bias that Benetton speaks of that will get better. But there's
It isn't
some
customary.
down
to
around the
live
corner.
here. I'll
But
tell you
there
what we'll
ain't.
do. We're going to attack a town that we tried to take once before. Many killed and many wounded. It was great fun. This time you're going with us. If any of us stops a bullet, or we die, we're going to come to you, click our heels together, and ask stiffly, "Please, Sergeant Himmelstones, may we go?"
You'll pay for this. You.
The next day during battle, Paul begins to smile at Himmel, knowing that he's now going to have to face combat. And sure enough, as gunfire begins and they charge forward, Himmel gets scared and cowers in a trench. Paul begins to tell him to get up and fight, and Himmel makes more funny noises.
You yellow rat! You yellow rat!
Until an officer who's running nearby tells them to push forward. And surprisingly, having now an official order, Himmel agrees and pushes on. It's weird, this moment of character. I expected Himmel to just kind of be the comedic relief as an overly strict sergeant, but after this scene, it's almost as if that was Himmel's comfort. The reason he was so strict and overbearing is because war is horrible, and the thing he relied on, just as the men rely on Cat, is a superior officer's order and just following protocol. So here he gets this kind of pseudo-courage because that's what the orders tell him to do. And as Himmel runs forward, he's cut down by gunfire. They continue to push forward until, like the French earlier, they're stopped by artillery fire and forced to retreat. During this retreat, Paul falls into a foxhole and gets separated from his men. As the French begin to push beyond his position, he hides in the foxhole, hoping none will see him. That is until the French begin to retreat and a soldier falls into the foxhole with Paul. During a quick fight, Paul pulls a knife and stabs the Frenchman, keeping him quiet so that none other can hear. After this, there's this weird moment of clarity with Paul where he realizes he's just taken someone's life in such an up-close and direct fashion. He goes down to the water in the trench and begins to physically wash the blood from his hands. However, the French soldier does not die right away and instead bleeds throughout the night. Paul begins to try to talk to him and says that he's sorry. He had to stab him. That's just what he's supposed to do. Paul begins to try to help him. He goes down into the water and tries to filter it to get the man a drink. Paul becomes tortured by this. He starts yelling at the man that he should just go ahead and die, and why is he making Paul suffer? Eventually, the soldier finally dies, and Paul is broken. He begins to ask for his forgiveness, and says that if it wasn't for the uniforms, the two could be friends.
Oh, God, why did they do this to us? We only wanted to live, you and I. Why should they send us out to fight each other? If we threw away these rifles and these uniforms, you could be my brother, just like Cat.
Yeah, the
He
sick
searches
man.
the man's coat and finds his wallet and a picture of his family.
It's really
Paul
fucked.
begins to
The
lay at the
radiation
dead man's
stuff.
feet and beg forgiveness, saying after the war he'll take care of the man's wife and parents and children. Paul feels broken, as he's never had to kill a man up close and then watches he slowly die. Another interesting thing about the scene is the actor who played the French soldier was named Raymond Griffith, and this was the final movie of his career. Raymond was mute, which adds another layer to this scene, as it's not only the language barrier that divides the two men, but the fact that the actor playing the soldier literally cannot speak to Paul. Raymond played in several silent films during his career, and with the new invention of talkies, or movies with audio, he was beginning to lose his stardom. So for his final role, he played a soldier from an opposing faction who can never hope to speak to his killer in the first place. Paul eventually makes his way back to his own lines, and while telling Cat of what happened, Cat says it's okay, and it's just because he had to kill someone for the first time, and it's not his fault, and hey, that's just war. The men have a few days to rest and go to a bar. While at the bar, Paul and his friends begin talking about women and how it would sure be cool to see a few. The next day, while bathing in the river, they see a group of women walking on the bank across from them. The men try to coax the women into the water, and after the women aren't interested, they decide to show them that they have food, and then the women want them to come over. It's not mentioned a lot, but this is a hint of the position that the French civilians are in during the war. The war hurt everyone, and those near the battlefield, just as the soldiers, had nothing to eat. After a guard tells the men they can't cross to the other bank, the women ask them to sneak out later that night. Also, during this bathing scene, the men are fully naked, and while nothing's shown in the movie because all the sensitive parts are below water, that was considered like blasphemy in 1930. Like, this movie got blasted by a lot of groups, which we'll talk about, and one of the reasons it was blasted in the US was for this and the scene that immediately follows. Also, while talking about things that were controversial but also funny, there's this one guy in the group named Jodin. He's one of Kat's men who's a seasoned soldier, so not part of the main group of boys. He was in the war before them. Apparently, they filmed a series of comedic shorts with Jodin, like in character, in World War I, just doing comedic stuff because audiences liked him so much. And next to Kat, he is my favorite character in the film. So that night, the men sneak out, again naked, to go see the French women, and after the women give them clothes to wear, they give the women the food, and the women are very excited to see the food, and then they romance the women. Now, nothing is shown, there's nothing explicitly said either, but what we get is a shot of an open doorway with the shadow of a bed frame cast onto the wall, as Paul explains to this woman how important she is to them, and the fact that they can't even speak the same language doesn't deter from the fact that he'll remember her forever. Now, this was over the moon for 1930. During this time, you never showed men and women hand-holding, for that matter, much less the implication of an unmarried man taking this French woman to bed. The Flintstones was considered controversial because it depicted Fred and Wilma in the same bed. Not doing anything in bed, just the concept of a husband and wife having one bed instead of two. So the scene was a lot, but it is again accurate to the experience of several soldiers. These boys want to carry out the dreams they've had for the rest of their life, like being with women. And despite seeking comfort, the only women they could be with are ones who could never possibly understand them. And this scene, while maybe not comfortable for audiences at the time, was certainly accurate. The next day, as they begin to march out into battle, they're attacked by artillery fire, and for the first time, Paul is injured by shrapnel. He's also injured alongside his friend Albert, and the two of them go to a Catholic hospital. While there, a man named Hammaker, who's been in the hospital for a while, explains to them that as soon as someone dies or is close to death, they immediately move them from the bed and take their clothes so that they can put someone in their place. Because the battlefield never has a shortage of dying men. This is shown as when a man collapses, within seconds, the orderlies have already remade the bed. Paul's friend Albert has both of his legs amputated, and as he struggles to come to terms with this, Paul is sent home on leave. As Paul goes home, he's certainly a different man from the one who left. He's now disillusioned and broken from the things he's seen. Remember that street we saw earlier with the parade and cheering women as these proud heroes march off to war? Well, here's that street now. Businesses going under as the economy begins to collapse, and a child playing with a soldier's kit. As Paul gets home, he's greeted by his sister and then wishes to see his mother, who's become very ill. There's something about this scene as Paul comes home to his mother. And I don't know if they told Beryl Mercer, the actress who plays Paul's mother, if this was her son or if she used to act like it's her son returning from war. But man, her performance gets me.
Here I lie and cry instead of being glad. Ernest, get down the child's blackberries. You still like them, don't you?
There's this melancholy to the entire time Paul's home, where despite being in his old house and wearing his old clothes, he's not the same boy who last put them on. This is emphasized whenever Paul goes to eat with his father and his father's friends. Among them is the teacher who convinced Paul and his friends to go enlist. As they toast him and talk about his valor in the war, the teacher begins to say how marvelous it is that he's a soldier fighting for the fatherland. There's also this really quick mention that says a lot without saying a lot that I appreciate. As the teacher is talking to Paul, he says this.
After all, you do at least get decent food out there. Naturally, it's worse here. Huh? But the best for our soldiers all the time. That's our motto. The best for our soldiers.
But as we know, the soldiers have barely anything to eat at all, and what they do get is scraps and leftovers. Because the people back home, whose country is falling apart, are being told that no, it's not because we can't supply food, it's just because we give the best to our boys on the front lines. But as we know, there is no best. This is all there is. And the propaganda that these people believe is that they are suffering for the betterment of others. And the people on the front lines believe that they are suffering for the betterment of others. But in actuality, everyone's suffering together. As they're talking, the teacher begins to pull out maps of the battlefield and immediately begin wargaming to Paul, talking about what the army needs to do in order to win the war. And as Paul begins to say that this is the last thing he wants to hear about and how terrible battling on the front lines really is, the teacher begins to tell him, well, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, sure, you know the battle and warfare, but I'm actually smart and have read books. So therefore, I know how this war's supposed to play out. And then from that, all of the men, besides Paul, begin arguing what the best strategy of the German army really is. And as they begin to yell and shout, Paul just gets up and leaves, and they don't even notice. Like I said, Paul is used to show the experiences of the author, Eric Remarque. And while everything that Paul's seen is a conglomeration of Eric's own experience and the experience of other veterans, as mentioned, like with the hands on the barbed wire earlier, Eric particularly talked about how whenever he got home, the men would constantly be pressing him to talk about how great war is. And whenever he would answer with the horrors of war, they would say, oh, well, you just don't know what you're talking about then. And while it's easy to condemn these people for their ignorance in the face of reality, and the story does here in just a moment with the teacher, but this is the same mindset that the boys had setting off to war. It took a lot of death and a lot of heartbreak for them to realize how brutal warfare really is. The movie never has a moment where it sits down and looks at the camera and says, war is always immoral, and if you ever fight anyone for any reason, that's bad. Instead, it serves as a warning for mindlessly sending boys out to die in someone else's war. And it does that simply by just portraying stories that soldiers experience. That opening sequence at the beginning, this is not a condemnation or a confession. Steven Spielberg once said that all war movies are inherently anti-war. And while I believe the truth is a bit more nuanced to that, there is truth in that because simply showing warfare is the biggest proponent against it. The next day, as Paul is walking through town, the teacher asks Paul to come speak to a group of boys about how great the war is and how they should all join up in order to save the fatherland. And when Paul gets there, he does not do that.
I can't tell you anything you don't know. We live in the trenches out there. We fight. We try not to be killed. Sometimes we are. That's all.
No, Paul. I've been there. I know what it's like. That's not what one drills on, Paul.
I heard you in here reciting that same old stuff, making more Iron Men, more young heroes. You still think it's beautiful and sweet to die for your country, don't you? We used to think you knew. The first bombardment taught us better. It's dirty and painful to die for your country. When it comes to dying for your country, it's better not to die at all. There are millions out there dying for their country. What good is it?
Paul!
You asked me to tell them how much they're needed out there. He tells you, go out and die. Oh, but if you'll pardon me, it's easier to say go out and die than it is to do it. And it's easier to say it than to watch it happen.
While looking in the faces of these young kids who were in the same position that Paul was a few years ago, Paul says that he needs to get back to the front lines right now because he needs to fight so that more of them aren't needed. That night, his mom sets up with him, asking him not to go back and how he needs to be careful and get a job behind the line so he doesn't have to be in danger. And it's a lot. But Paul is not the same boy who left her years ago. He's now a different man who is determined to fight so that others don't have to. The next day, after Paul returns to the front lines, he comes to find that no one he knew is still there, meaning more than likely, they've all been killed in one battle or the other. As a matter of fact, the boy out front is only 16 years old. So just as in the beginning of the film, whenever Kat and Jodin had Paul and his friends come in as replacements, now Paul is the seasoned warrior who is having more children come in to back him up. But as Paul is sitting there, sure enough, Jodin walks back in and the two are reunited. Jodin was out looking for food, so Paul begins to ask him of everyone who was there when he left. Westus, one of his friends, died while trying to save a wounded messenger dog.
Where's Westus? Messenger dog was wounded. He went out to get it.
And the man who earlier missed his wife and his farm back home attempted to desert, but was caught by the German army.
Where's Datory? He got homesick. You remember about the cherry blossom? I guess he never got over that. He started out one night to go home and help his wife with the farm. They got him behind the lines, and we never heard of him since. He was just homesick, but probably they couldn't see it that way.
But thankfully for Paul, Kat is still alive, and Jodin mentions that if Kat were to die, they'd probably have to call the war off. Paul asks where Kat is, and Jodin mentions the direction he is, saying that he's out looking for food. The two are reunited, and Paul begins to tell Kat of how he now feels like a stranger back home, and the war's really all he has left.
Tell me, Paul. How's it at home? Have a good leave? And Spots, what's the matter?
Oh, I'm no good for back there anymore, Cat. None of us are. We've been in this too long. The young men thought I was a coward because I told them that we learned that death is stronger than duty one's country. The old men said, go on, push on to Paris. My father even wanted me to wear my uniform around. It's not home back there anymore. All I could think of was, I'd like to get back and see Cat again. You're all I've got left, Cat.
I'm not much to have left. I missed you, Paul.
Kat begins to talk and mentions that it seems like the war should be over, and it doesn't seem they've got a lot of fight left in them.
Push on to Paris? You ought to see what they've got on the other side. They eat white bread over there. They've got dozens of airplanes to War One, and tanks that'll go over anything. What have we got? Guns so worn they drop shells on our own men. No food, no ammunition, no arms. Push on to Paris. So that's the way they talk back there.
But that regardless of what happens, they've got each other and they'll stick by each other's side. As they begin to walk back, a bomber flies overhead and drops an explosive. A piece of it hits Kat in the leg, and Kat's now unable to walk, so Paul begins to carry him. As Paul is carrying Kat, a second bomb is dropped, and this one seems to not harm either of them. But little known to Paul at the time, a piece of shrapnel struck Kat in the neck. And whenever Paul makes his way back to the field hospital, he finds that Kat is dead. Kat was Paul's final connection back to all of this. He hates the war and he doesn't fit in at home. And Kat was his friend. He was a man that he was close to, and really his only foundation that he had left to keep running on. So now, as Paul is stationed on the front line, it seems that everything's just kind of pointless. So one day, while waiting out on the front for something to happen, Paul sees a butterfly land just outside of the trench in front of him. Paul stands up and reaches out a hand to try to pick up this butterfly, and as he does, a French sniper spots him. And as Paul reaches forward, a gunshot rings out, and his hand falls to the earth. We now have our final shot of the film, as we see the scene from earlier where the boys looked back at the truck leaving them as they stepped out on their first deployment, now overlaid with the graves of those who died in World War I. Every face who looked back, now lying among the dead. All these stories, all of these personalities and people we once knew, now among the white crosses in a field in France. And with that, we have the ending of All Quiet on the Western Front. As I mentioned earlier, the experiences of this story are based on the perspective of the author Eric. And obviously Eric didn't die in the war as he had to write the book, but the send-off to the character is how one of many deaths could have occurred. The title of the story is instant between artillery fire and trench warfare, and how their deaths amounted to cannon fodder. It was always someone else's war, and they were just the pawns fighting it. And while we experience these characters, while we know Paul's relationship with his mother and his personal inner turmoil over the war, and how all of this led to his death, that doesn't matter, because he's just one of many. As far as the people need to know, it's all quiet on the Western Front. Now, as mentioned, when this movie came out, in the United States, there were various groups who didn't like the violence and, the mention.
We're gonna take a little bit of a break. Smoke break. Let's get high, y'all. Oh my god, I forgot to drink. I said I was gonna drink earlier, and then I was like, because I was all depressive for a moment, and then I got distracted by, my duty to be an entertainment source for you guys, and I didn't get drunk. I could still get drunk, but then again, I might go to sleep in a few hours, but then again, I might just stay awake till like 10 a.m. Do I morning drink, y'all, or do I not? It is currently 5:51 a.m., which is like when people get up sometimes. But at the same time, it's when I'm going to go to bed is like around, an hour from now, maybe 2 hours from now, maybe 3, 4, whatever. Somewhere around then. I'll go to bed before noon. But yeah, let's just take a little toke, a little smoke break, and hop back into the nature of life. More just woke videos, just waking people up to the reality that For every person that's happy, there are 10 people that are sad. BRB.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, everybody. BRB. Testing 1, 2. Okay, there my mic's working again. But yeah, we're back at it again. Got the alcohol, 95%, straight Everclear, and it's gonna burn, baby. But that's well, I don't know. Nah, I don't feel like it. Let's just jive for a moment. I don't know what anybody have suggestions of what to do? Could watch something good. At the very beginning, I was for sure doing some singing and stuff, so the video's already copyright struck. But I mean, so I can do basically whatever. We reviewed some intense, the horrors of life that can never be compensated for. Individual experiences that can never be compensated for. I don't know, man. I'm just gonna vibe for a little bit. You know, set the banner. Damn, slap the banner. Put the invite link so anybody can join and talk with me if they want. Pontificate together. Otherwise, I mean, I've done a lot of activism today. I mean, I've laid the arguments out for people in multiple forums. Direct testimony of experience, logical equations, different perspectives, you know. What I think is the objective truth that experience is valuable. The Christian perspective that hell is dangerous. Buddhist perspective, second reincarnation, whatever you want, you know. It's easy to lay out on it today, pretty much. God's suicide, being his will, all this stuff. Basically just kind of laid it out for those people. So it's been covered today. Now it's just kind of people want to ask questions or vibe or want me to watch anything particular, review something. Otherwise, I'm just going to be here to do my duty, answer questions, help people with things, and I'm going to be playing Fortnite and can ruin some people's day. Probably not getting any wins, but I'm going to get close and ruin people's days, get like average like 8 kills or whatever, and fail in the end, inevitably. The huge.
Throughout this series, the focus has been on antinatalism, the idea that it's unethical for humans to reproduce, that humans get a rough deal and are better off not being brought into existence. There are different ways of approaching antinatalism. Some antinatalists believe that overpopulation is a problem, and we should therefore try to limit the amount we reproduce in order to reduce the population. The Chinese one-child policy is an example of this kind of antinatalism. This type of antinatalism is sometimes referred to as Malthusian antinatalism, named after the English scholar Thomas Malthus. Malthusian antinatalists argue that it's unethical to have children under certain conditions, but that there are possible conditions under which it may be ethical to have children. Another popular antinatalist group is the voluntary human extinction movement. VEMT believes that humans are responsible for environmental degradation and that the eradication of man-made suffering would solve the problem of resource depletion and allow the animals to thrive. The final antinatalist idea is Efilism. It's life spelt backwards. Whilst many ethicists agree that population control and human extinction have merit, it only deals with part of the problem. The tenets of Efilism are that life itself is a backward and broken system, at least sentient life. While humans are responsible for their fair share of suffering, it's merely a drop in the ocean of suffering that occurs on this planet. While nature documentaries and popular science paints a picture of food chains, niches, and a controlled ecosystem supervised by Mother Nature, the reality is that sentient organisms are involved in a chaotic and brutal battle for survival. And this is not a problem that goes away simply by ignoring it, by going vegan, or even by bringing about the extinction of humans. Ephilism states that a universe without sentient life is preferable to a universe with sentient life. If there were a red button that one could press to end all life instantly, Ephilism argues that one would be ethically obliged to press it. Another thought experiment has been proposed as a way of softening the inevitable outrageous reaction, a red button that would sterilize all living organisms on the planet. While this also carries with it its own fair share of problems, for many it's a much more psychologically comforting thought experiment. Naturally, the reception to Ephilism is often one of fear, horror, and even anger. Many mistakenly believe that Ethilists advocate for going around killing people and animals left, right, and centre. Its detractors often claim that it's a death cult followed by radical extremists. Comparisons to Nazis or ISIS are never far away. The truth is that Ethilists are people concerned with the problem of evil and suffering in the world. They're often vegans and people with lifestyles that aim to minimize their ethical footprint. They recognize the reality of our situation, that sentient life is caught up in a biological game that it cannot win. Animals are vessels for their DNA. The goal is to survive long enough to reproduce, no matter the cost, no matter the pain, no matter the suffering. The prize? Creating more players to play the game before dying, almost always painfully, pushing a heavy rock up a hill for the sole purpose of passing the same burden on to another before meeting a grisly death. The DNA molecule ensures that its vessels stay motivated through several psychological programs, so that we can write poems and aphorisms rejoicing in our rock pushing burden, shame those who see the activity as ridiculous, and even to invent a magic endgame where one is finally free of their rock pushing duties and lives in paradise for eternity. A love of nature and life can be explained psychologically, but can never be defended rationally. Some statistics may help to paint a more accurate picture of the reality we live in. Humans are responsible for some 50 to 100 million animals being in research laboratories and about 24 billion animals in livestock, not including fish. The suffering these animals endure is well known, and VEMT claims that human extinction would solve these problems. However, what about animals in the wild? The number of animals in the world is so numerous that to calculate it would be almost impossible. One estimation by mathematician and or 20 billion individual animals. To put that into perspective, that's 3 times the approximate number of grains of sand on the earth. This includes some 70 billion wild mammals living emotionally rich lives as sensitive to cold, hunger, and pain as ourselves. Many people claim it's cruel to keep animals in zoos and circuses, citing their mistreatment and suffering, but then ignore the suffering that occurs in the wild. Suffering is suffering, whether it's man made or not. An elephant being whipped by a human doesn't dislike the activity more than being eaten alive by a crocodile on the basis that it's unnatural. The value is in the suffering, and our concern should be with the suffering too, regardless of whether it's part of nature or not. Ethicists believe that all suffering is valuable and we should seek resolutions to this problem. The fact that many can rid themselves of the idiocy of religion only to replace it with another idiotic notion of nature knows best is testament to the resilience of our programming. Our disposition for blind spotting inconvenient and painful truths is a fascinating sign that we carry with us nuanced and somewhat sophisticated psychological software, but it's a tragic failure of our capacity to do philosophy well. What kind of mental gymnastics would it take to be confronted with the indisputable fact that unimaginable numbers of feeling organisms are brutally tortured and destroyed in the most horrific manner one can imagine, and then to respond with, that's nature though, or even worse, to conclude that this suffering is meaningless as it's a them and not a me, despite the biological evidence showing their suffering to be indistinguishable from our own in any meaningful sense? In the time it takes you to watch this video, thousands upon thousands of living, breathing, sensitive organisms are eaten alive, bleeding, panicking, whimpering, terrified, writhing in excruciating pain. Others are dying slowly of thirst, hunger, and cold, and are being eaten alive slowly from the inside by savage parasites. The pleasures that organisms feel are, at best, mild compensation for the brutal pain and suffering they will endure, and not a justification for the game they're involved in. Can it really be rationally defended that this is a fair trade-off? If we are to take the problem of suffering seriously, can it rationally be argued that on the balance of things, sentient lives being brought into existence are profiting? Pressing the red button may run contrary to our programming and cultural cultivation, but can it really be unethical? Our time in existence is limited. The day will come when sentient life ceases to exist, leaving no trace that we were ever here. We cannot save ourselves from death, but we can choose how much pain and anguish we will allow to continue. Pressing the red button immediately brings to an end the unfathomable torture that's occurring this very second, and saves an even more unfathomable amount of potential future torture. The alleged downside is that future generations will not come to be. But for whom is this a problem? Non-existent beings cannot be deprived of anything, but they can be spared the potential suffering that their coming into existence guarantees. For the moment, the red button is only an exercise in the hypothetical world. In the next video, I'll look at various ways in which the endgame can be brought about gracefully and ethically, and how humans are already unintentionally, precariously flirting with human extinction.
What is Efilsong? Efilsong is an acknowledgement that the function of DNA replication, living things, once they acquire sentience, is waste. Now there's something of value to waste. When they're just robots, when they're just machines that aren't feeling, who cares? Let the matter dance however it wishes to dance. But when it starts dancing on pain receptors in brains and obnoxious feeling sensors, then there's an important value that can be wasted, can be unnecessarily squandered for no profit. The word waste is pretty much an acknowledgement that life is fundamentally and intrinsically beyond repair. It doesn't make function, it makes friction. It makes waste. It doesn't create anything but opportunity for failure. And that's it. It makes the harmable and then it harms it. No sense to it. No sense in opening the door to it. Because none of the stories we could possibly ever tell would ever be worth the torture imposed to tell it. The delusionary experience of, oh, wow, what a fascinating story. It makes me feel, ooh, comfortable. But why? Because you're afraid of a world that didn't tell you that story. You're discomforted by a world that doesn't give you lies to live by. The native condition is miserable. And all you're trying to do is put band-aids on it. Try to heal the wounds of existence, wounds of need and deprivation, and we don't do it profitably. It's a disproportional distribution of the pain. Even the things you think are free, a smile, some little pleasantry, they're not really free. The comfort you derive is going to be proportional to the hunger endured. More importantly, in the environment, in the DNA gone wild world, the waste is so much more extensive. And it's the maintenance of that system of redundant torture and destruction that can't be justified. There's nothing we're doing that can justify it. There's nothing in the good that can pay for the imposition of the bad. It's just wrong to impose on something like torture. The other argument is more to do with just this fundamental nature of the psychology and the fact that even though we think there's a game to play, it's a loser's game. You're just fighting to get to the surface of the water. You're fighting not to drown. You're not going to profit from this experience. You're just going to minimize your losses. You'll feel grateful. Hey, I'm grateful I don't have. You can go through the list of all the things you can be grateful you don't have. 2 heads. A dead brother stuck to my side. Oh, I can feel good. Oh, I don't have it as bad as that. But that's an artificial comfort. It'll get you to the surface. It'll get you a gasp of air. But you shouldn't need the air in the first place. If I was to put in a sentence what constitutes the meaning of spelling life backwards, life fundamentally can't run a profit because there's absolutely nothing in the universe. There's no broken that humans fix.
Do we have a purpose? Our purpose is just to get more complicated? Purpose in just becoming more complicated? Come on, the game is all about our desire. That's all it is. It's a chasing desire game. And it's all contrived through evolution by a damn molecule, you dumbasses. Consumption, reproduction, for no end. There's no end here. There's no purpose here. It's a mechanical process, like fire or like any other chemical process. Once it starts, well, boom, it's going to keep going until it runs out of fuel. This is just so reckless. We're a type of fire. We're a forest fire. We're a chemical reaction that's going to keep on happening because this one cell acquired the ability to reproduce itself. There was a suitable environment and nothing killed it in any one stage of its existence. And so it's just going to keep doing this shit until, it runs into some kind of brick wall, and the brick wall won't have anything left to consume. I mean, the layers of living things will be so thick that house of cards will fall in on itself. An asteroid, the planet blows up, some sort of scenario. But the idea of deliberately taking this stupid thing that we're doing, we're fucking goddamn bugs. Let's build a $1 zillion spaceship and put a mosquito in it and send the mosquito off to another planet to go do mosquito stuff. For what? It'd be a stupid thing to do. It'd be goddamn idiotic. Let's go send some praying mantises into space. But I really haven't got to the meat of the argument yet. Because you run into this amazing problem where the argument doesn't even have to be made. You can get the God delusion out of people's heads and the nature delusion. Somehow nature knows what it's doing. I mean, once you defeat those two delusions, there's nothing to argue here. I mean, the facts are obvious, and they point directly to we are just caught up in addiction. We are just addicted to this shit. So we keep doing it. We keep doing it because we're addicted, damn it. We're not doing it for a fucking rational reason. We're doing it because we're horny for another day. And we've been made horny. Just so fucking being played. The strings are just so now obvious that what's pulling them is goddamn fucking microbe, you assholes. This would be like the basic intention. Like if you had to sum up life in one paragraph, this is the one paragraph I wrote. And basically it'll be the job of the book to explain why this is the truth. And all your other bullshit is just that bullshit. We humans are just one of the eccentric forms of reproducing matter that has evolved over billions of years on the material planet we call Earth. We do possess the faculty of consciousness, the ability to think and feel, but in simple truth, that ability serves no intention, and there is little probability that we can put that faculty or ourselves to any universally constructive or more than contrived purpose. We are in fact as a kind incapable of doing anything of merit beyond cleaning up the messes we and the rest of the material universe make. Life is in fact just a harmful parasitic infection that can at best only achieve the minor brilliance of perhaps someday terminating the mistake that was its instigation. So there, that's the truth. That's the fucking truth. Best we can do is get the fuck out of this game. Take our losses, get up from the table and say, that's enough, no mas. Quit fucking with this goddamn thing, because you can't win, you dumb asses. All you can do is scratch itches. Do you understand that? Something has to bite you. Something has to irritate you, fuck you up, before you can go to the process of relieving deprivation, your misery, your itch, your negative. You know, and that's all we can do is just fix the negatives. Negatives that don't have to fucking exist in the first place. All purpose is a delusion. I mean, all purpose beyond janitorial duties, beyond managing the suffering that's all the fuck around you, you assholes. It's a human race. What the fuck have we done to merit going to any other planet and doing it over there? We've got billions of animals in captive, harsh, brutal, torturous slavery. Most of the human population is living in squalor, in shit, just eking out existence. Even if we perfected this stupid thing we call life, it's still accomplishing nothing. It's merely entertaining needs that don't need to exist. This is not scratching any itch the universe has.
Just look at the function, okay? You can keep dreaming that you're doing something, but you're not. You're consuming, you can reproduce, and you're doing it in an environment of psychology, okay? Ego. These things of addiction and cannibalism, where you're basically exploitionist. You exploit the environment. You exploit the other animals to create an environment you can exist in. See the real price tag for everything you live in and on. How many animals had to, in some way or another, be consumed so you could have what you have. It's a mechanism that was built by crude forces. There's no temperament here. There's no controlling of how out of control it can get. And for you to impose that, to do it willfully and deliberately, in my opinion, is illogical.
The life itself sucks. That life itself is not something that's benign and neutral.
It's silly to say it's benign and neutral when you see in the world how unbenign it is. Elephant man disease, or, you know, as the grotesquest of the examples. But the brain tumors, the cancers, the horrible circumstantial deaths, the slow, miserable deaths being crushed in a coal mine, all this shit that goes on here every fucking goddamn day. And do you say, oh, it's all benign because somehow I think my little adventures and my little joy moments somehow make up for all that crap? I don't think it makes up for any of it. I wouldn't impose, if the real price tag was to have my joyful life, a 6-year-old kid's got to have chemotherapy for 3 years. There's no part of my joyful life that I think is worthy of a kid having cancer for 3 years. Not one single fucking, no way I can contrive that equation in my head that I have some valuable experience, like my first moment having sex, or the first this, or the first that, or whatever virginal experience that you think are so magical and precious. I wouldn't say, let's duplicate that by torturing a fucking kid for 3 years. But that's the real practical fact. When you have a kid, that's what you're guaranteeing to exist in the world, you stupid fucks. So in my opinion, yeah, you're not only stupid, you're sadistically stupid.
But pain, suffering sucks, right? So you're not looking at what comes out of suffering. As a matter of fact, this is probably why
I mean, what comes out of suffering? Again, this whole thing, character is a great thing, okay? So a little bit of suffering is a wake-up call. It can make you more empathetic, more of a human being. But by the same token, we know that too much suffering just destroys everything that you are, everything that you could be. It takes away your faculties. Migraine headaches don't make people brilliant thinkers. So this is just bullshit, these fucking goddamn cliches. So not only you're perverting language, perverting definitions, perverting the whole function of language, you're sitting there justifying living on cliches.
You know, the Nietzsche, why Gary's so against Nietzsche is because he said anything that can't kill you only makes you stronger.
That can't kill you, it doesn't kill you. Okay, so you didn't even say it right. But again, it's just a cliche. It doesn't have any depth. You scratch at it just a little bit, you can knock the veneer off of that. And of course, yes, there is something valuable in having to fight for it, having to practice, having to earn your gold medal. Yes, there's some kind of integrity to that kind of triumph over the adversity and all that kind of crap. But that's all just stoic, psychobabble bullshit. That's the ego again. That's the ambition, the ego, the driver, the desire. This is the contrivance of your brain. It isn't a value in the world, just as the Martian doesn't need to enter the Olympics and win the high jumping contest. The non-existent Martians don't need to do that.
He would be, you know, Nietzsche's bringing up the character of an individual after going through suffering, and how that character has developed, how it's gone through that suffering, and how now it's got a greater depth of character than it would have had before had it not.
Or else it's disabled by fear now, or it's crippled by the suffering. So again, this works both ways. It just isn't a truth of reality. All right, that suffering is intrinsically good, and any of that character building is worth the price you have to pay for it. And how many people go through suffering and don't build any character whatsoever? All they become is petty and angry. They become malicious bastards, things that just start hating on the world and making it suffer because they suffer. How many people have endured suffering and then they end up imposing the suffering? They get beat up as a child, they get abused by their parents, and then they beat their wife. How many people have done that? The complete reverse. They've become less of a human being through suffering.
So the whole idea is that suffering sucks, right? As opposed to just suffering is. Pain.
Yeah, whatever. Suffering is, right? So just take away the substance of it, right? It is intrinsically and fundamentally, every fucking word we have in our vocabulary to describe something negative is associated with a consciousness in some state of negative suffering character. Every single negative word. There's no way to even describe a negative without somehow it implicating a consciousness in some kind of distress. Just pretend that isn't the reality, that it is a bad thing, and just say, oh, it's just suffering. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, fuck you.
I don't know, man. More keep streaming.